Story 1. The Silent Riders of Angaram, Persia's first postal couriers. You close your eyes and the noise of the modern world fades only to be replaced by the rhythmic beat of hooves on dirt. Not hurried, not leisurely, just consistent, just enough. Because the rider is trained to ride not for speed but for balance endurance over weeks, not hours. You are now riding through ancient Persia, circa 500 BCE, at the height of the Achaemenid Empire. You are riding with the Angaram, the royal couriers. Before a letter was ever posted, before a sealed message ever reached its distant recipient, there had to be a route. There had to be a horse. There had to be a human willing to ride into the farthest frontiers of empire, often alone, sometimes forgotten. These were the Angaram, the silent riders whose footsteps were paved in protocol and whose presence was mandated not by glory but by governance. The concept of long-distance message delivery was not new by the time Persia institutionalized it. Earlier systems existed in Egypt and Mesopotamia, but the Achaemenid Empire, stretching over 2,500 miles from Susa to Sardis, required something more, something boring, something precise. And so it began with Darius I, known more commonly for administrative reform than battlefield conquest. Darius understood that a sprawling empire wasn't held together by loyalty alone. It was paper, roads, and the people who carried them. The Angaram were born not as a military solution, but as a civil necessity. What made them unique wasn't their existence, it was the scale of their operation, their unbroken reach. From the arid plains of Bactria to the coastal stretches of Lydia, they were entrusted to deliver not just orders but continuity. A functioning empire was an informed empire. Their paths were laid out along what would become known as the Royal Road, a marvel of bureaucratic engineering more than stone masonry. The road stretched roughly 1,600 miles, from Sardis in modern-day Turkey to Susa in today's Iran. Along this backbone ran an artery of riders, spaced between strategically placed stations known as chaparkhane. Each station was about 20–30 miles apart, the distance a horse could manage before fatigue set in. At each post, a new mount awaited, fresh and watered, ready to carry the next leg of the message. Imagine the early mornings at one of these stations, a silent outpost in the desert, a kettle boiling barley water, a boy checking the horse's hooves, a scribe copying a clay tablet onto parchment or sealing a fresh dispatch. There is no drama here, no battles, just procedure, just reliability. The riders were not armed messengers nor soldiers. They were trained professionals, selected for their endurance, discretion, and reliability. Most of them were not of noble blood. Many were of Median or Elamite descent, pulled into service by regional governors. To be a courier was to be trusted not just with a message, but with silence. You may wonder, how were these riders instructed? Was there a school for them? No formal academy existed. Instead, it was a system of apprenticeship. Young boys, often stable hands or sons of existing Angaram riders, would learn the routes, the signals, the protocols. They would learn when to speak and when not to. They were taught the sacred ritual of not reading what they carried. Each rider bore a leather satchel, known as a payam, usually double-pouched to separate outgoing and return messages. Some of these carried wax-sealed parchments. Others, impressively, included clay tablets in protected wooden cases. Most messages were encoded in Old Persian, Elamite, or Aramaic, the administrative languages of the empire. Often, the Angaram did not know what language their burden held. That was not their concern. Their timing was legendary. Herodotus, the Greek historian, famously recorded, "Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds." Centuries later, this same phrase would be inscribed above the New York City post office, a silent nod to these forgotten riders. But speed is a relative thing. The Angaram's relay system allowed a message to travel from Susa to Sardis in just 7 days, a staggering feat in an age without engines or steam. Most regular traffic would take 3 months, but a royal message, It flew by ancient standards. The reality, however, was more measured. These riders were not racing. They rode deliberately, mindful of terrain, weather, and political unrest. A missed stop or an injured mount could derail not just a message, but military campaigns, tax collections, even royal succession. Interestingly, the Angaram were not simply instruments of kingship. They carried more than royal decrees. They delivered census results, irrigation data, provincial grievances, and trade inventories. In effect, they were the first long-distance civil service agents. Despite the clear hierarchy of the Persian Empire, the Angaram network was surprisingly democratized. Governors, military commanders, and senior merchants could request a rider under specific conditions. Of course, permission was required and there was a fee for non-royal usage, but the infrastructure was shared. This was not a courier for kings alone. It was the bloodstream of an empire. And yet they are largely forgotten today. There are few statues, no epic poems. We remember generals and rebels, but not the men who made their orders possible. These were not riders seeking fame. They were riders seeking the next station. What did a day look like for an Angaram courier? It started in darkness, often before sunrise. The message was checked, the mount inspected. They traveled mostly alone. Talking to strangers was discouraged. They had set phrases and signs to identify themselves at checkpoints, silent codes known only to the network. Each station had a logbook, updated meticulously. If a message was delayed, the log could trace exactly where the failure occurred. By the time the sun reached its zenith, the courier would have ridden 20 miles or more. He would arrive at the next station, dismount, log the delivery, transfer the message, and rest perhaps for only a few hours. Then, depending on assignment, he would double back, continue onward, or return empty-handed to the station of origin. Their pay was modest but consistent. They were fed at stations, given basic lodging. Injuries were documented but rarely compensated. It was a lonely profession, a necessary one. And here lies the paradox. These men, so vital to the empire, were invisible by design. They were the wires behind the curtain, the heartbeat beneath the marble of Persepolis. And yet, if the Angaram faltered, the empire would have known chaos. Provincial revolts would go unreported. Tax reforms would stall. Military aid would arrive late. A world powered by parchment, undone by one broken horse. Which leads us to an intriguing question. What happened when a message never arrived, when a courier vanished between stations, without a trace? You're standing at the edge of a vast desert plain, somewhere between Arbela and Ecbatana. There's no road marker, no monument, just a shallow impression in the earth, a place where hooves passed again and again over years. The path you're watching isn't merely a road, it's a habit, etched by human resolve and the recurring passage of the Angaram. But what if the hoofbeats never reached the next station? What happened to the riders who simply disappeared? The Persian Empire, like any complex machine, depended on its quiet gears turning reliably. But now and then one of those gears slipped. A courier didn't arrive on time, or didn't arrive at all. The relay chain broke. Orders were delayed. A distant province, left in silence, assumed neglect or worse, betrayal. And what did the station keepers do then? A delay of an hour was logged. A day, noted. 2 days, reported. By the 3rd day, a relay rider from the next station was dispatched backward along the road. Their mission was not to deliver but to investigate, to retrace the last known segment, to find a discarded satchel, a broken mount, a body. Rarely was anything found. These men vanished without a trace, swallowed by terrain and politics alike. Some were likely victims of banditry, a consistent threat along less traveled segments of the royal road, especially near the Zagros foothills. Others might have run afoul of local rebellions, ambitious satraps, or whether far harsher than expected. There are even whispered accounts, barely documented, of riders who chose not to complete their journey, who absconded, satchel and all, to vanish into the very lands they once traversed faithfully. But these failures, though infrequent, exposed a fragility in the system. The Angaram were human. The terrain was punishing. The empire was vast. This led to a secondary feature of the Persian postal system: redundancy. Darius, or perhaps one of his more cautious bureaucrats, implemented a rule that every royal dispatch was to be duplicated. A second version of the same message would leave half a day behind the first. The riders would travel different routes where possible, avoiding duplication of risk. If the first failed, the second would still arrive, perhaps late, but alive. The system tolerated no gaps in communication. Interestingly, this duplication came at a bureaucratic cost. Records show that the empire often had to resolve discrepancies between the two versions of the same message. Different handwriting, slight translation variations, seal imperfections, all these added complexity to what should have been a straightforward redundancy. But to the Persians, the risk of confusion was preferable to the risk of silence. And still they vanished. One curious case survives in a fragment of an Aramaic administrative tablet discovered near Persepolis. It refers to a letter of the sun lost between station 18 and 19, a cryptic phrase interpreted by scholars to mean a royal message that never arrived, despite all precautions. The tablet notes that the second seal reached Sardis unharmed, but the first was not found, nor the satchel, nor the man. It concludes with an unceremonious line: "Another rider has been dispatched. The matter is closed." No reward, no search party, no statue in memoriam, just silence. This culture of erasure, while chilling, was deliberate. The system could not afford sentiment. The road was sacred, but the rider was replaceable. It was around this time, likely late in Darius' reign, that the first shadow records were introduced. These were coded documents held at key outposts. They listed active riders, their usual paths, and known family contacts. In the event of a disappearance, these records were used not for rescue but for replacement. A cousin, a son, a stable hand familiar with the route. The wheel turned again. Now, let's turn away from tragedy for a moment and look at the incredible effort that went into making this system function in the first place. Each Chapar Khan, a relay station, wasn't just a stable. It was a complete logistical hub. At a minimum, it required a stable master, who managed the horses and oversaw their feeding, grooming, and rotation. A station clerk, responsible for message logging, dispatch records, and seal verification. A scribe or translator, as messages often needed to be reinscribed between languages or formats. General staff, to cook, maintain the buildings, and care for injured riders or animals. In regions prone to snow or flooding, additional staff were tasked with maintaining alternative paths. The Angaram couldn't afford to wait for the seasons to change. The empire demanded news whether the roads were dry or frozen. Horses were central to this machinery. Not just any horse could serve the Angaram. Persian-bred Nicaean horses were famous for their strength and stamina, but even they had limitations. A horse could typically manage a 20-30 mile gallop without rest. That's why stations were spaced accordingly. Upon arrival, a rider would quickly dismount and transfer the message to a fresh mount, wasting no more than minutes. The process was practiced to mechanical precision. Each station kept at least 6 horses ready at all times, 3 for outgoing, 3 for return. This reserve required constant feed, care, and inspection. The economics of the royal road were substantial, but justified by its function. It was the nerve cord of the Achaemenid world. And what messages justified all this? Contrary to what you might expect, the Angaram did not carry only grand royal decrees or military strategies. They often delivered grain harvest reports from Egypt, tax tallies from Bactria, census records from the Median plains, weather updates, yes, weather from mountainous satrapies. This was essential for predicting agricultural disruptions. Even personal requests moved through the system. There are rare references to messages exchanged between noble houses, or from governors requesting artisans, engineers, even court performers from the capital. Provided they paid the fee and bore the correct seal, the angaram would deliver it. Sometimes they even carried small parcels, royal gifts, insignias, samples of cloth or dye, and once, according to Herodotus, a bag of Sardis soil meant to symbolize loyalty to the great king. But no message was ever more important than one that arrived on time. As the system grew in sophistication, Darius introduced message rings, a curious administrative innovation. Each region was assigned a color-coded ring or seal pattern that identified its origin and date. This allowed scribes and officials to prioritize messages at a glance. Royal orders bore gold-embossed rings. Tax records had simple iron seals. Emergency, military messages were marked with obsidian black. This system, too, came under strain as the empire expanded. Regions like Sogdia and Gedrosia on the empire's edges were poorly connected. Messages there could take months, not days. Some reports were even sent by boat up the Tigris or Euphrates to merge with the land-based Angaram route. These intersections water-meeting horse were marvels of logistics, but also of friction. In border areas, local administrators began developing hybrid courier systems. These would sometimes bypass the official angaram. They used camels instead of horses, relayed through tribal allies rather than formal stations. To the central bureaucracy, this was frowned upon but tolerated. The empire was about unity in structure but flexibility in execution. Yet for all this complexity, the core of the system never changed. A man, a horse, a message. Let us now peer into the psychological reality of the angaram. These were not romantic couriers galloping through meadows. They were bound by oath, routine, and secrecy. They rarely interacted with townsfolk. They didn't speak of their assignments. They ate alone at stations, slept in designated quarters, and were often rotated every few months to avoid familiarity with the terrain or locals. Why? To prevent corruption. A rider who grew too close to a regional power might be persuaded to read, delay, or alter a message. The empire feared this not because it was common, but because it only needed to happen once to erode trust. One document from a Babylonian satrap, recovered in a temple archive, complains that the new rider arrives without knowing the language. He does not greet the priests. He is a ghost upon the road. This complaint was filed and ignored. That was the point. The angaram were ghosts by design, reliable, silent, efficient. And still they vanished. We are left to wonder, what were their thoughts in those final moments, those whose messages were never delivered? Did they fear failure? Or did they know the system would replace them and the message would still reach its end? Even today, archaeologists uncover fragments, clay seals, worn leather straps, traces of relay stations lost to time. There are no tombs for these couriers, no names etched in stone, only their system survives in memory. And with that memory, another question arises. Did the riders ever read the messages they carried? And if they did they ever act on them? The sun is low as you imagine yourself once again on the edge of the royal road, its dust now centuries settled, its stations long buried beneath layers of sediment and time. You hear no hoofbeats. The angaram are gone. The empire they served, too, is a relic, but traces of their silent existence still ripple across our modern world. What became of the system after the fall of the Achaemenids? When Alexander the Great swept through Persia in 330 BCE, burning Persepolis and toppling the great king, he inherited more than gold or palaces. He inherited infrastructure, roads, systems, a model for governance. Alexander did not dismantle the angaram. He simply rebranded it. He recognized what Darius had crafted, a delivery system not of tribute or treasure, but of trust. Without communication, his vast new dominion would crumble before it had even stabilized. And so, The royal stations were repurposed. Riders continued. Greek clerks replaced Persian scribes, but the rhythm remained. Later, the Seleucid Empire maintained remnants of the system in the eastern territories. Though diminished in scale, the concept of relay couriers endured. Some stations became military outposts. Others evolved into trade hubs. The Angarum themselves, if still active, had likely blended into the roles of local riders or military messengers. They lost their name but not their purpose. Centuries later, during the Parthian and Sassanid eras, new courier systems emerged, bearing striking resemblance to the Angarum. These systems adopted a caste of riders, bound to specific routes, trained from youth. Historians often debate whether this was a direct inheritance or a reinvention, but the bones of Darius' vision were clearly present. Even the famed Roman cursus publicus, the imperial courier service of the Caesars, shows uncanny similarities to the Persian model: way stations, official riders, coded messages, and a strict protocol of silence and urgency. In fact, the Romans likely learned from their eastern neighbors, adapting the Persian ideas to their own bureaucratic labyrinth. This evolutionary line continues, in fractured but unmistakable form, through the Byzantine dromos system, the Mongol yam, the famed postal network of Genghis Khan, the Ottoman Tatar couriers, feared and respected alike, the Pony Express in 19th century America, and finally, the global postal services of the modern world. From the flicker of torches at way stations to the digital pings of modern email, the need remains the same: to carry a message across distance reliably and with trust. Yet for all this continuity, we rarely ask, what did the Angarum believe about themselves? Were they proud? Were they afraid? Did they feel loyalty to a distant king they never met, whose orders they could not read? We find a curious reflection in a fragmented inscription from a station near Ecbatana. It reads, "The king knows not my face, nor I his voice, but I ride because the message must pass." This nameless rider captured what perhaps many felt: duty detached from glory. Indeed, the Angarum were not warriors, priests, or lords. They were functionaries, and it is in this bureaucratic anonymity that their strength lay. Their work was sacred not because it was celebrated, but because it was consistent. A society, especially an empire, is built not only by grand gestures, but by small acts repeated with unrelenting precision. Their invisibility was their shield, their consistency their armor. But not all was silent. Occasionally we catch whispers of rebellion from the ranks. A clay shard held in the archives of the Oriental Institute references a rider who refused an order. His name, Parvena. He tore the message, abandoned his satchel, and returned to his home village, citing mistreatment at the hands of a regional clerk. His fate is not recorded, but his act was proof that even in the strictest systems, the human element persisted. Another Angarum, Tarseshta, appears in 3 separate records over 10 years. Unusual for a rider. His name is linked with multiple provinces, suggesting either remarkable skill or dangerous favoritism. Scholars speculate that he may have served as an internal courier inspector, a kind of ancient quality control officer. If so, he may be the earliest known example of a postal auditor, an inspector of the empire's invisible lifelines. Their existence is often minimized in historical records, which focus on kings and wars. But without the Angarum, those wars may have collapsed. Orders would not have reached the front. Governors would have operated blindly. Revolts would have gained ground before news of them reached the capital. The Angarum were a barrier against entropy, against disintegration. And it is precisely their boring, unchanging nature that made them revolutionary. Let us not forget the logistical foresight of their architects. The interval timing between riders, the horse rotation schedules, the logbooks that functioned as proto-archives, the coded seals precursors to modern verification systems. This was not accidental. It was engineered. And while not as flashy as pyramid construction or palace architecture, it was arguably more foundational to the empire's day-to-day survival. Even their psychological design was ahead of its time. By isolating riders, discouraging community engagement, and rotating assignments frequently, the system reduced the risk of sabotage, bribery, or ideological contamination. It's a method still echoed in modern intelligence protocols. Now imagine for a moment the quiet grief of families whose sons rode and never returned. No grave, no confirmation, just absence. The Angaram died as they lived, in service and in silence. And yet, one wonders, did they ever keep secrets? Did a writer ever, just once, glance at a torn seal and read the words within? Did they, upon learning of a provincial rebellion, warn their village before the empire's army arrived? Did they alter routes, delay messages, or quietly destroy warnings to save lives? We have no proof, but we have the question. Because systems, no matter how well designed, always bend under human hands. That is their fragility and their beauty. A reflection. As we close this first story, what remains isn't merely a tale of men and horses, but of function over fame. The Angaram are forgotten not because they failed, but because they succeeded so well that they left nothing behind but traces. Their reward was continuity, not celebration. And yet, it is their story that echoes down every well-worn road, in every bureaucratic system, in every messenger's oath. Even today, when a letter arrives on time, when an email travels halfway across the world in seconds, a part of the Angaram rides with it. Not for glory, not for recognition, but because the message must pass. Story 2, Dust and Wax Seals, How Achaemenid Dispatches Crossed the Empire. You find yourself in a dimly lit archive, deep in the heart of an imperial administrative complex, perhaps in Susa, Persepolis, or Babylon. The year is 498 BCE. The air is thick with ink, dust, and the heavy silence of bureaucracy. In this quiet room sit 3 scribes, bent over wooden desks, their reed pens dancing slowly across parchment and clay. In the corner, a small brass stove melts wax over low flames. The room isn't filled with drama or decree, but with routine. And yet, this is where empires speak. Before a message could ever be delivered, before the hoofbeats of the Angaram sounded over the plains, the words themselves had to be made official. Not spoken, not whispered, but written and sealed. The Achaemenid Empire, sprawling from the Aegean Sea to the Indus Valley, needed not only roads and riders, but records messages that meant something because they were sealed with the weight of sovereign will. And so we begin with an unassuming tool, the seal. To the modern eye, it might appear trivial, a small carved cylinder, often stone or baked clay, rolled over wax or clay to leave an impression. But in the Achaemenid world, this tiny object was as powerful as any sword. It was identity, authority, and authentication combined. The Persians did not invent the seal. That honor likely belongs to the Sumerians or even earlier Mesopotamian cultures. But the Achaemenids standardized and expanded its use like never before. Every official message, from grand edicts to grain tallies, required a recognized seal to be considered valid. These seals weren't just decorative. Each bore specific symbols: lions, winged horses, the Faravahar, or even the stylized image of Darius himself. They communicated who had authorized the message, often more effectively than a signature. Many were individualized, tied to one person or office. Some were even passed down through generations. The act of sealing a document was ritualistic. First, the message was written either on parchment, papyrus, or clay tablet, depending on the region and context. Then it was folded or rolled, and a small blob of wax or clay was affixed at the seam. While still soft, the seal was pressed into the surface. If it dried without tampering, the message was assumed secure. To break the seal without authorization was a crime akin to treason. But seals weren't only used to secure content. They also tracked the message's chain of custody. Hear how that worked. Imagine a military report drafted in Sardis, on the western edge of the empire. The regional commander dictated the contents to a Greek-speaking scribe. Once written, the message was sealed with the commander's personal signet. Then, it passed to a provincial courier hub. There, a second seal belonging to the local satrap's office was added to indicate official transfer. When the Angaram rider collected the message, another stamp, often from the relay station clerk, was pressed onto the back of the satchel or message tag. If that rider failed to reach the next station, investigators could trace where the message had last been seen. The seals told the story. Some documents had 5 or 6 seals by the time they reached Susa, a veritable breadcrumb trail of bureaucracy. The materials varied by region. In dry provinces, clay was common, as it could be sun-baked quickly. Along the Nile or the coast, papyrus and wax were used. More formal decrees were often written on treated parchment, especially in Aramaic, the empire's lingua franca. The language of the message was another layer of complexity. The Achaemenid Empire was multilingual. While Old Persian was the official royal language, few outside the central bureaucracy could read it. In practice, administrative messages were most often written in Aramaic, which served the same function as modern diplomatic English. Elamite and Babylonian cuneiform were also common, especially in legacy regions. A royal message might pass through multiple translations during its journey. Hear how that played out in practice. A decree written in Old Persian would be translated by court scribes into Elamite and Aramaic. Copies would be created for distribution to various provinces. Some copies would be condensed versions, designed for rapid reading by governors. Others would be full legal texts, intended for archival purposes. Each copy required a distinct seal set, confirming it was an authorized duplicate. Interestingly, this multilingual redundancy served a second purpose: protection against forgery. A forged document might replicate the appearance of one language, but replicating the exact phrasing and style in 3 languages, plus their seal patterns. That was considerably harder. The complexity of the system became its security. But what happened to the messages once delivered? In many cases, they were not discarded. Rather, they were archived, a practice that became a point of pride for the Persian state. Clay tablets were stacked and labeled. Parchments were rolled and stored in ceramic jars. Wax-sealed letters were kept in wooden chests, cataloged by origin, date, and purpose. These archives existed in Susa, Babylon, Ecbatana, and Persepolis. When Alexander conquered Persepolis, his men found entire rooms filled with such records, though tragically, most were later destroyed in the infamous fire. Only fragments survive. We also have indirect evidence of their effectiveness. When Xerxes launched his invasion of Greece, his armies moved with incredible coordination across multiple regions, supply lines, and allies. Such an effort required a vast chain of preparatory messages sent months in advance. The surviving Greek sources mention how the Persians never marched without writing. Their bureaucracy preceded their armies. But with such volume came another challenge: traffic. During major campaigns or census periods, the number of messages increased dramatically. To manage this, the Angaram employed priority seal symbols that indicated urgency. A wax seal with a lion's head might mean military urgency. A crescent could indicate a religious or festival-related order. A seal shaped like an open hand indicated royal personal business. These always took precedence. Clerks at relay stations were trained to recognize these symbols instantly. It was a quiet language of empire, unspoken, but understood by those in the system. And yes, mistakes happened. In a recovered letter from a station near Arbela, a scribe complains. The message with the broken seal arrived out of order. The lion was faded and was placed beneath the crescent. The writer did not wait for correction. We feared delay. Even the smallest details, the positioning of a seal, the impression's clarity could disrupt entire chains of command. At the personal level, seals were a source of pride. Scribes often wore them around their necks. High officials had custom boxes to store theirs, complete with soft cloth wrappings and oil treatments. There were even seal inheritance disputes where sons argued over the right to use a deceased father's signet, especially if he had held an office of prestige. One nobleman in Bactria, according to an Aramaic papyrus, tried to claim land by using his uncle's outdated seal. The case was escalated to Susa, where it was dismissed on the basis that the seal is known, but the man is not. In other words, identity and seal were one. Let's pause to consider the mundane beauty of this. Every day, countless documents moved quietly across the empire. Tax forms, marriage records, livestock counts, river flood predictions, all of them sealed by people you've never heard of, moving along roads you cannot see, shaping a world that would one day become the foundation of modern statecraft. They were not dramatic stories. No battles, no love affairs, just dust and wax. But in these details, the creased parchment, the barely legible script, the slightly smudged seal, lies the heartbeat of civilization. Because without them, no king could rule, no army could march, no bridge could be built, no temple supplied, and no farmer taxed. And yet these messages, once vital, now lie buried in the sands of history, faded, lost, or perhaps waiting to be found again. So we ask, what messages still lie beneath the ruins, sealed and forgotten, waiting to tell us the mundane truths of an empire? The seal is dry, the wax has hardened, the courier is already on the road, but the message lingers first in the archive, then in memory, then, eventually, in silence. Let us return to the place where messages were born, the administrative heart of the Achaemenid Empire. In today's bureaucracies, documents are filed in color-coded folders and sorted in databases. But the Achaemenids used a different system, one made of clay, parchment, and the quiet labor of trained scribes. It is here we encounter one of the empire's most enduring bureaucratic marvels, the Persepolis fortification tablets. Discovered in the 1930s in the ruins of Persepolis, these clay tablets, tens of thousands in number, offer a dry and detailed glimpse into the engine room of an empire. They are not filled with epic proclamations or royal speeches. Instead, they tell of grain allocations, livestock movements, worker rations, and administrative routes. Nearly all of them are sealed. These tablets, though far removed from the dramatic narratives we often associate with empires, reveal a much more telling truth. The Achaemenid Empire thrived because of routine. Consider this. A tablet might record the distribution of beer to laborers at a construction site. Another might track a shipment of dates and dried figs from Elam to Babylon. A third might log the number of donkeys used to haul building materials over 3 weeks, identifying which animal was assigned to which handler. Each entry is boring, each is brief, and each one is sealed. Behind these tablets sat entire teams of scribes, fluent in multiple scripts: Elamite, Aramaic, and Old Persian. Their role wasn't to create grand literature. It was to track, to verify, to preserve. They wrote not for the future, but for the system. But where did the messages go once they were written, and who made the decisions about them? Enter the satraps, the regional governors of the Persian Empire. Appointed directly by the king, these men wielded enormous power. They oversaw taxation, defense, legal judgments, and most crucially for our story, communications. A satrap's office contained an inner scribal court where messages were received, translated, and responded to. A seal archive containing the master seals for different classes of correspondence. A message ledger, a running list of all messages sent and received, their dates, senders, and outcomes. A logistics chamber staffed with riders, handlers, and stable masters, who interfaced with the Angarum network. When a message arrived from Susa or Persepolis, it was first logged by the receiving scribe. The seal was inspected for tampering. If intact, it was broken, and the document read aloud to the satrap. If required, the message was then translated into a local language or languages and duplicated for subordinates. After this, the satrap dictated a response or an order. A new document was prepared, sealed with his ring, and dispatched. Each of these steps was recorded. Nothing was casual. Even a one-sentence message acknowledging the receipt of grain supplies might require 4 steps. Drafted by a scribe, reviewed by a supervisor, sealed by the satrap or his deputy, logged into the regional message ledger. The ledger system was one of the marvels of Persian administration. We know from excavated records that many regions kept dual copies, one stored in the satrap's archive, the other forwarded monthly to Persepolis. This had 2 functions: to confirm compliance, to create redundancy, ensuring that even if a station or regional office was destroyed, the records of its actions would survive elsewhere. Much of this was made possible by standardized formats. Messages were often written in template form, with only names, dates, quantities, and specific directives changing. Seals, likewise, followed a design taxonomy. Different shapes, edges, or central images indicated message class and origin. A satrap's administrative seal might feature a lion, while his personal seal depicted a cypress tree. Clerks were trained to recognize the subtle differences. There was even a system of code words and phrase tags embedded in messages, especially those of political or military sensitivity. A phrase like, "the rivers run clear," might signal that a region was secure, while "the granaries are late in harvest" might imply unrest without stating it overtly. These codes were not random. They were updated seasonally and taught in clerk briefings held at designated stations. If a code changed, a sealed scroll would be sent to each regional capital, instructing the scribes on the new language of communication. This ensured that if a message was intercepted, it would be meaningless without the seasonal cipher. Even the storage of messages followed strict rules. Clay tablets were stored in labeled baskets or wooden shelves, often sorted by month, region, and type. Parchments were rolled and tagged with string, their seals pressed into a wax blob that held the string knot in place. High-priority messages were stored upright in sealed clay jars to protect against moisture and tampering. Destruction of records was rare, but when it did occur, it was intentional and ritualized. Old archives were buried under layers of lime or fire-treated earth. This was not only to dispose of them, but to honor their role in the empire's function. It is here that we glimpse a deeper cultural truth. To the Persians, administration wasn't a tedious necessity, it was a moral function. The act of recording grain shipments was as sacred as building a temple. Sealing a message properly was a form of order, and to neglect it was to invite chaos. This ethos is echoed in the Behistun inscription, where Darius the Great lists his achievements. Among his victories in battle and rebellion, he proudly proclaims, "What was destroyed I restored. What was scattered I gathered. I wrote the law, I sealed it. I had it sent." The seal is a recurring image in Persian governance. It doesn't merely close a message, it confirms reality. And so the messages traveled. Sometimes they changed hands 5, 6, 7 times. Each handler added a mark, a seal, a log entry. And at the end, when the message arrived in some windswept outpost or sun-bleached village, it carried more than words. It carried the trace of the empire itself. It's worth reflecting on what this meant for the people governed. A farmer might never see the king, but he saw the seal on the tax order. A village priest might never visit Persepolis, but he obeyed the parchment that arrived from his satrap because it bore the seal of Susa. The seal stood in for the state. It was the state. The quiet miracle of this system wasn't that it worked quickly or flawlessly. It was that it worked at all, over centuries, across thousands of miles, involving dozens of languages and hundreds of officials, all bound by trust in a small symbol pressed into wax. And it was all so very boring. But that boredom was its power. It lulled rebellion to sleep. It made the machinery of empire run smooth and quiet. It brought order to the invisible. And so we are left with a question. How much of the world today still depends on quiet seals and routine messages carried not with fanfare, but with trust? You are standing near the banks of the Euphrates. The sun is descending into a long, patient dusk. A rider appears dusty, lean, unspeaking, his satchel sealed, his message unopened. Behind him, the empire has already begun to shift. It is 331 BCE, and the Persian world is on the brink of collapse. Yet here, in this quiet patch of Mesopotamia, the paperwork flows on. This is the paradox of imperial communication. The messages often outlast the meanings they once carried. Let's trace this final leg of the journey, not just of one message, but of an entire system as the Persian Empire reaches its end. The system at the edge of collapse. By the late 4th century BCE, the Achaemenid Empire was under extraordinary pressure. Alexander of Macedon had cut through Asia Minor like a blade through parchment. Persian satraps were divided, some loyal to Darius III, others hedging their bets. The roads were still open, but trust in their direction was beginning to fray. And yet the messages still moved. We know this from surviving records and fragments. A clay tablet found near Babylon records a food requisition approved by a local governor in the name of Darius III, a full 2 months after Alexander's forces had taken control of Tyre. Clearly, the message had taken time to travel, but more importantly, it had been processed, logged, and responded to. This suggests a deeply rooted habit. Even as the body of empire fell, the nervous system kept firing. Why? Because systems like this are not easily turned off, not when they have run for generations. The angarum still rode, seals were still pressed. Local administrators, perhaps unsure which ruler to obey, simply continued the rituals of empire. The ink dried as it always had. The archives were still maintained. Inertia ruled. There is a tragic dignity in this. A letter bearing the great king's seal, arriving at a city already pledged to Alexander, would be treated with quiet reverence, perhaps read aloud in a room where everyone knew it was too late. And yet they logged it anyway. It speaks to a deeper truth about the Achaemenid system. Communication wasn't just functional, it was ceremonial. The act of sealing a message, of passing it along the chain, was an affirmation of continuity. A way to say, we still exist, even as borders crumbled and armies defected. Some messages, however, never arrived. The last messages that never reached their destinations. There is an account, fragmented and disputed, of a message sent from Persepolis to the satrap of Bactria during the final months of the empire. It reportedly carried an urgent call to raise levies in support of the faltering royal army. The letter was sealed with the Lion of the East, the mark of the military council. But the message, it seems, never made it. How do we know? Because in Bactria, a different set of records survive. Alexander's scribes noted the surrender of local troops without resistance, and without having received any official order to do so. The implication: either the message was intercepted, or it arrived too late. Imagine being that rider, pushing through arid plains, carrying what you believe is a rallying cry for resistance, only to arrive and find the enemy already welcomed. The rider's burden becomes irrelevant, a message too slow for the speed of collapse. And this wasn't unique. As Alexander advanced, relay stations began to fragment. Some closed entirely, their keepers fleeing or killed. Others switched allegiances, beginning to carry messages for the Macedonian administration even as Persian orders still passed through their gates. One remarkable tablet from Susa contains two messages, one in Aramaic and one in Greek, both dated within a week of each other. The content, identical, a request for grain redistribution. The seals, one from a Persian governor, one from a Macedonian general. Same message, two masters. The station had hedged its allegiance, issuing copies to both powers. It is here we begin to see the evolution of communication, not just as logistics, but as politics. The seal became more than authority, it became a signal of who was still pretending to be in charge. And eventually, the pretending stopped. After the fall, echoes of the seal. Alexander, for all his destructive conquests, was no fool. When he finally took Persepolis and burned parts of the palace complex, he spared many of the administrative buildings. He recognized, like Darius centuries before, that roads and records mattered more than marble. He did not abolish the angurum, he co-opted it. New seals were minted. New languages began to appear, Greek alongside Aramaic. Many Persian scribes remained in place, now drafting orders for a Macedonian court. In effect, the wax changed color, but the system remained. And this echoes through time. Because empires fall, but administration lingers. In the Seleucid period, Persian-style seals are still found, now bearing Hellenistic motifs. In the Parthian and Sasanian eras, the use of clay sealings, especially for tax and military messages, surged once more. Even under Arab and later Islamic rule, parts of the old satrapic message system survived in Persian provinces, adapted into new structures of governance. But the bones are the same. Write it, seal it, send it, record it, archive it, obey it. This unbroken chain is what makes the Achaemenid message system one of history's quiet triumphs. Legacy in the modern world. We no longer press seals into wax, but we still encrypt, authenticate, and timestamp our messages. Every secure email you send, every government document marked with a stamp, every registered parcel with a barcode, these are descendants of the same idea. Today's digital signatures serve the same function as the ancient seal, to say, this is real, this is from me, this has not been tampered with. When we trust the source, we trust the message. And so, somewhere deep inside the mechanisms of modern civilization, beneath the blinking lights of data centers, and the silent processing of routers, the shadow of a Persian scribe still lingers. A final thought. If you were to open one of those messages today, unroll the parchment, brush away the wax flakes, and read the ink now faded to brown, what would you see? Would it be a list of donkey feed allocations, a tribute schedule, a report on road repairs near Ecbatana? Most likely, because history at its core is not made of grand speeches and battlefield cries. It is made of memos, of receipts, of messages sent, received, and forgotten. And in that boring pile of dust and wax lies the real machinery of empire. So perhaps the next time you open a letter, scan a barcode, or affix a signature, you'll pause, if only for a moment, to think of the long-dead scribes, hunched over their tables, sealing the will of kings not with swords but with silence. And perhaps you'll ask, how many forgotten empires still speak, quietly, from the seals we have yet to break? Story 3, Roads Without Names, The Forgotten Trails of Elam and Media. Close your eyes and imagine this. You are walking, not riding, along a narrow, rutted path. It curves around a hill blanketed in low, coarse grass. The air is heavy with dust. There is no signpost, no markers, no road-wide paving stones or carved milestones. And yet this trail, beaten only by centuries of repetition, carries goods, words, and people between ancient cities. You are in Elam, long before the Persian Empire had risen, and long before the royal road earned its name. This is the story of the trails that came before the road's routes that had no formal names, yet shaped the very foundations of Persian infrastructure. The story of Elam and Media, regions absorbed into the Achaemenid Empire, but whose silent paths made the rise of Persia possible. We begin in the eastern highlands, in a time when stone and silence spoke more than records. Elam, the early web of trade and travel. The region of Elam, located in the southwestern part of modern-day Iran, has an ancient pedigree. Its civilization dates back to the 3rd millennium BCE, older than Babylon, older than Assyria, and contemporaneous with Sumer. It had cities like Susa, Anshan, and Haftep that flourished long before Darius or Cyrus ever took a throne. And between these cities ran paths, not roads as we understand them, no paved surfaces, no formal engineering, but well-used, deeply ingrained ruts of movement. These trails were built not by decree, but by habit. The Elamites were skilled traders, miners, and administrators. Their routes were dictated by necessity. The movement of tin and copper from the Zagros, the transfer of grain and wool from the plains, the ceremonial processions between religious centers. These trails were shaped by climate. In the rainy season, alternate paths were used. In dry spells, shortcuts through riverbeds emerged. Over generations, they became known but unmarked, a kind of mental cartography passed from one traveler to another. What made these trails unique was their decentralized logic. There was no central government coordinating infrastructure. Instead, local city-states maintained their portion. A trail might shift course if a new canal was dug. It might fork around a newly raised hill shrine. And yet, in spite of this fluidity, the system worked. Goods moved. People arrived. Messages delivered orally or carried on clay tablets found their destination. We have evidence of these early Elamite communication, paths through clay tablets found in Haftep and Susa. These tablets include inventory lists noting where goods originated and where they were expected, labor records showing journey times between villages and storage sites, references to the High Trail and the West Crossing, not formal names but familiar markers. The Elamites even developed logistical protocols, assigning porters and animals to specific stretches of the trail depending on terrain. Some of these routes, remarkably, were still in use when the Persians formalized their road system 1,000 years later. Media, a network of mountains and memory. North and east of Elam, nestled into the western Iranian plateau, lay Media. By the 8th century BCE, Media was a growing power, rising after the decline of Assyria. But it had no imperial identity, only a network of tribal alliances and city-states, bound together more by pathways than politics. The Median trails are some of the most forgotten roads in history. They are almost completely absent from formal records, and yet the terrain itself tells the story. Between the cities of Ecbatana, Ragi, and Hulwan, archaeologists have found layers of compressed dirt and stone, deeply worn into the landscape in places that would naturally connect river valleys to mountain passes. These impressions are not accidental. They are the ghosts of trails. What makes Median travel notable is its seasonality. Unlike Elam's more stable lowlands, Media's uplands were subject to dramatic climate shifts. Snow blocked certain passes in winter. In summer, grazing paths dictated movement. The Medes, skilled horsemen and herders, timed their trade and communication routes with animal cycles and mountain weather. Their trails were, in effect, living roads, always changing, always responsive. Travel in Media often involved relay herds. Rather than staging horses at stations, Median travelers used grazing nodes, natural stops where animals could rest and feed. These were usually small glades near freshwater springs, and they became informal hubs. Some were even considered neutral zones where rival tribes could meet. Oral traditions suggest that Median trail keepers, often older herders, served as the memory banks of the road. They would sit near trail forks and direct travelers, sharing stories, advice, or cautionary tales. In the absence of maps, these elders were living waypoints. This practice echoes later Persian customs. The Angaram system, centuries after Media's peak, also relied on experienced station keepers who had memorized terrain and timing. The infrastructure was new, but the idea was old. Unseen but not unknown. The question arises, if these trails had no formal names, no mile markers, no written records, how do we know they existed? The answer lies in the convergence of archaeology, linguistic drift, and administrative inheritance. In ancient Elamite records, references to the Trail of the Seventh Hill, or the crossing near the Broken Stone, appear repeatedly, across generations. These may have been informal names passed down. In Median territories, similar turns of phrase appear in Old Persian texts centuries later, describing the path near the lone cedar, or the place where goats drink before the rise. These are not random, they likely trace back to local trail knowledge absorbed by the expanding Persian state. Satellite imagery has revealed linear indentations not wide enough to be roads, but too consistent to be animal tracks cutting through the Zagros and Alborz foothills. These almost certainly represent ancient foot and hoof traffic, hardened over centuries. In this way, the unnamed trails of Elam and Media are not lost. They are unwritten, but not unremembered. From trail to road, the Achaemenid absorption. When Cyrus the Great rose to power in the mid-6th century BCE, uniting the Medes and Persians, one of his first moves was to co-opt existing trail systems. Elamite paths became western feeder routes to Susa. Median trails were mapped and formalized into military and administrative corridors. Local knowledge keepers, once informal guides, were brought into service, assigned roles at newly constructed relay posts or supply depots. This integration was not disruptive, it was incremental. The Persians did not pave over these old trails. They followed them, formalized them, and sealed them into memory with messages, stations, and royal orders. By the time Darius constructed the famed royal road between Susa and Sardis, he wasn't inventing a new highway. He was connecting existing arteries, building on the boring but reliable skeleton already formed by Elamite traders and Median herders. A moment of pause. If you were to walk those same hills now, you might find nothing. A valley too quiet, a trail long swallowed by erosion, but listen closely. There is still a rhythm, a ghost path, a memory of where people used to walk not because they were told to, but because they had to, for salt, for wool, for stories, for survival. And the question remains, how many great empires walked unknowingly on roads first worn by shepherds, traders, and unnamed couriers long forgotten by history? The trail curves along a riverbank, cut gently into the soil by centuries of passing feet, hooves, and carts. It is a path that has existed for so long that no one remembers when it began. It was never surveyed. No decree established it, and yet it endures. By the time the Achaemenid Empire emerged under Cyrus the Great, these trails had already connected the internal provinces of what would become the empire's heartland. They didn't require construction, they required recognition. That's what Cyrus understood, and what his successors would later formalize. To build an empire, you must begin by acknowledging the roots that already exist, codifying the invisible, from trail to infrastructure. When Cyrus conquered Elam and Media, he didn't tear down their systems, he absorbed them. His army used Elamite mountain passes and Median grazing corridors. His administrators inherited more than land, they inherited the invisible logic of local movement. But these trails, scattered and seasonal, posed a challenge to imperial order. That's where Darius I stepped in. The great reformer, the spreadsheet king of antiquity, didn't want roads to merely exist, he wanted them measured, categorized, and controlled. He issued surveys not with measuring tapes, but with scribes and field clerks. These surveyors walked the trails of Elam and Media and recorded their features. Where rivers crossed, where the land narrowed into passes, where travelers commonly stopped for rest or water. They collected oral reports from locals, used route timing estimates from couriers and herders, and compiled detailed travel logs. Some of these documents likely became the prototype for the royal itinerary, a kind of route chart or timetable used by Persian officials. We have indirect evidence of these surveys in documents from the Persepolis Fortification Archive. The trail from Anshan to Susa is counted 5 days by foot, 3 with donkey, 2 days by chariot if unladen. In the spring, 4 days. These notations were not poetic, they were data, recorded in the dry voice of administrators. Based on this intelligence, Darius established a tiered road system. The Royal Road, primary administrative corridors for rapid Angaram dispatches. Provincial roads, key supply and travel routes between satrapal capitals and major towns. Local trails, existing pathways absorbed for regional use, sometimes improved but often left as is. The last category included many of the Elamite and Median trails now formally registered, but not fundamentally altered. Trail keepers and station builders. To manage these inherited paths, Darius instituted a new class of bureaucrat, the road overseer. In Elam and Media, these officials were often locals' former porters, herders, or scribes who knew the land intimately. Their duties included reporting damage or obstacles along routes, ensuring way stations were maintained, keeping records of traveler flow and travel times, monitoring for banditry or unsanctioned toll collection. These overseers worked in conjunction with Chapar Khan, relay station keepers, who handled the Angaram operations. Interestingly, some ancient trails were preserved because they were less efficient. That is, they were kept as fallback routes, to be used when the main road was impassable. This is one of the first known uses of a redundant routing system in overland communication. A tablet fragment from a station near modern-day Hamadan notes, "The royal road is drowned. Message sent by the path of the elders. Arrival delayed one night." The path of the elders, likely a reference to the older Median trail, bypassed in normal conditions but still functional. Markers without names. Unlike Roman roads, the Achaemenid infrastructure didn't rely heavily on stone milestones. Instead, they used natural features and oral identifiers. A bent cedar tree might mark a turnoff. A black rock formation was used to gauge midday progress. A particular spring's taste was said to signal you were halfway between two towns. These became semi-official markers. Later records refer to the Hill of Broken Reeds or the Shadow Bend as if they were cartographic references, and in a way they were. In the hilly terrain of Elam and Media, memory was the map. The word path appears in several languages across this period. In Old Persian, Ra. In Elamite, Hada, likely route or line. In Median dialects, reconstructed, terms equivalent to the trodden way or the high step. But rarely were trails named. To name them was to fix them in place. These were living, shifting things. They defied such simplicity. Even when the Achaemenid Empire began using stone way stations, often marked by imperial emblems, the original trail identifiers persisted in regional usage. Trails of tribute and tax. The Elamite and Median routes weren't just used for movement, they were funnels of imperial wealth. Tributes of gold, tin, and textiles from the Zagros were carried on these trails. Military supplies moved along these routes during campaigns in the east. Regional tax assessments were based, in part, on how many weeks it would take to move goods to Susa or Persepolis. A grain requisition tablet from Elam notes, "Wagons of flour to depart after thaw, 3 days to the Fork Trail, 4 more to Susa. Add 1 day for mules with weak hoof. Again, the language is plain, practical, and boring, but it represents the living pulse of empire. The rhythm of movement shaped policy. Governors argued for lower quotas if their region was farther from major roads. Merchants timed their sales based on seasonal passability. Even military drafts took into account how long a man would need to travel to a mustering site. The trails without names had power. Ceremonial uses of ancient trails. While most uses were economic or administrative, some trails, especially in Elam, held religious and ceremonial significance. Pilgrimage routes connected local shrines, some later co-opted by Persian cultic practices. Processional paths were used in local festivals honoring fertility or water spirits. These trails were often embellished with ritual markers, such as stone piles or carved staves left in the ground. Even as Persian state religion evolved, respect for these paths remained. A few inscriptions reference the sacred way when referring to these older routes. Though not aligned with Zoroastrian theology, they were preserved perhaps as a nod to local beliefs, or perhaps because the empire recognized that destroying a trail meant severing community memory. In this way, roads became more than practical, they became political instruments, balancing central authority with local continuity. When roads fade, what remains? Centuries later, when Alexander's conquests swept through Persia, many of the main roads were repurposed. Greek commanders followed the royal road, built forts along its spine, and laid down stone where once there was dust. But many local trails were simply left to fade. As new urban centers rose and fell, the old trails lost their meaning. Springs dried up, rock markers crumbled, grazing patterns shifted. The trails without names became roads without users, and eventually memories without trails. And yet, occasionally, travelers even today in the Zagros report seeing grooves in the rock, stone piles, or flattened patches of earth where no modern path exists. Shepherds pass them without comment. Locals walk them without questioning. You could be following the same trail once trod by an Elamite porter 3,000 years ago. A quiet question. We spend so much time studying empires through the lens of power, conquest, and law. But what if the better lens is the path? Not the grand highway, but the unassuming trail, passed down in silence, walked without ceremony, and remembered not in writing but in steps. So we ask, how many of our modern roads still follow lines drawn not by surveyors, but by forgotten feet centuries before kings and centuries before names? You stand now at a ridge overlooking a broad, dry valley. There are no signs, no noise, just wind and the faint impression of something once etched deep into the earth. You wouldn't notice it unless you knew what to look for. A curve too deliberate, a strip of soil worn smooth, stones arranged not for defense or art but simply to mark a direction. You are standing on one of history's countless forgotten roads. This is not the story of a military conquest, nor a famous speech. This is the story of infrastructure that did not ask to be remembered, and yet it remains not in history books but in the bones of the land. When the trail ends, but the journey continues. By the time of the Seleucid Empire successors to Alexander in the Near East, the trails of Elam and Media had already begun to fade from formal maps. The new Greek rulers brought different priorities, and new settlements shifted the flow of traffic. But even then, the older trails persisted beneath the surface. Some Seleucid administrators reused Elamite routes, particularly in southern Iran, where geography had not changed and no better path could be forged. But few of these paths were renamed or monumentalized. Instead, they were quietly incorporated into the new logistics, still called by the same old local identifiers. The path of the seventh rise, or the spring crossing. A papyrus recovered from Dura Europos hundreds of years later makes mention of a delivery of wine amphorae from Susa, using the winter trail between mountain settlements. This may be one of the last known references to a route once considered Elamite in origin. It was the same story in Media. Though urban growth around Ecbatana made that city a hub for Roman-Parthian exchanges, the rural highland trails were increasingly isolated. What remained of them was folded into village memory, carried by shepherds and passed down in simple instructions. Follow the sun until the crooked stone, rest near the cold spring. When the hawks fly high, you're close to the plain. These were not coordinates. These were mnemonic maps, shaped by seasons and senses. And in the quiet of empire, they endured, rediscovering the trails, modern clues in ancient places. You might wonder, what can we still find? Modern archaeology has begun to trace these shadow roads using a combination of satellite imaging, detecting slight depressions or unnatural linear features in the soil, drone-based LiDAR scans in foothill regions of western Iran, revealing compacted earth beneath later layers of sediment, ethnographic mapping, where local oral traditions and walking paths are recorded and compared against ancient waypoints. In some cases, a trail identified in this way perfectly overlaps with Elamite settlement patterns, suggesting continuity from at least 1800 BCE through the Achaemenid period. One example is the Trail of the Salt Men, a long, narrow corridor through the mountains between old Elamite salt deposits and central plains. Even today, herders in the region use it during winter migration. Local children are taught where the Listening Rock sits, a naturally echoing stone once used to signal distant travelers. This trail does not appear on any historical Persian map, but it still exists. Similarly, in the province of Hamadan, ancient Ecbatana, certain dirt paths used by modern villagers follow lines that are far older than their towns. They cut across valleys with no settlements in sight and follow water courses that dried up centuries ago. Yet the habit remains. In these discoveries, we glimpse the slow sediment of human behavior, the persistence of movement long after the movement's purpose has faded. Why boring roads matter more than famous ones. We often think of roads as the product of empire built after conquest, paved with victory, and commemorated in stone. But in truth, roads, especially the unnamed ones, are often what make empire possible in the first place. The royal road of Persia, praised by Herodotus, may have been formalized under Darius, but it was preceded by these unnamed trails. The grandeur of imperial infrastructure was layered upon the invisible reliability of village paths, tribal routes, and seasonal migrations. These trails were not created by decree. They were carved by necessity, softened by repetition, and reinforced by quiet trust. A potter moving clay to a kiln, a priest walking to a shrine, a widow carrying wool to market. These small decisions, repeated over generations, built the grooves of empire long before any king declared them a road. Even today, our modern highways and railway lines often follow the same logic. Connecting water sources, following elevation gradients, avoiding flood zones, linking economic nodes. It's rare for a modern road to be entirely new. Most follow centuries-old decisions, echoing movement patterns forged by people who left no written record but left a path. The human memory of distance. In societies without writing, the trail is not only a physical route, it is a mental construct. It is measured not in miles or stadia, but in songs, rituals, resting places, and stories. Among the Medes, it's believed that routes were memorized through chants, verses passed from elder to child that marked not just the direction, but the feel of the path. After the high grass the sun bends, after the shadow the jackal howls. This kind of narrative geography survived long after maps appeared. Even Persian satraps are known to have employed local guides who recited trails like stories. It was only in the late Achaemenid period that route descriptions began to include numerical measures, so many days by foot, 2 days by chariot, and so on. But even then, the older mental maps continued in the background. They were embedded in the culture, and they often proved more reliable in a crisis. When royal roads were blocked due to flood or war, it was the trail elders, the herders, and the merchants who knew the old ways, those lesser roads, that reappeared like ghost veins in the empire's circulatory system. In this way, the unnamed trail became the empire's last line of resilience. When you step off the map. So what happens when the trail is gone? Some vanish completely. Floods, landslides, wars, they wipe out the shallow grooves. Others are absorbed into new infrastructure and renamed. Some are buried beneath cities that forget why they were built there in the first place. And just a few remain unmarked but unforgotten. There's an irony here. The trails we remember best are the ones written in books, but the trails we used most often, the ones that shaped everyday lives, were almost never written down. They lived in memory, in habit, in song. They were boring, beautifully boring, which raises a quiet, unsettling question. What part of our modern world, our cities, our networks, our habits rests invisibly on the decisions of forgotten feet walking forgotten trails? Final reflection: the road is the record. To walk the trails of Elam and Media is to walk history without monuments. No arches, no statues, just paths, etched not in stone but in silence. They remind us that the foundations of great civilizations often lie in what no one thought to celebrate. A shortcut between two fields, a crossing near a spring, a habit passed down from mother to child. The empire rose because these trails existed, not the other way around. So the next time you walk a quiet path, far from maps or markers, and feel the faint sense that others have walked here too. They probably have. And their footprints, though unseen, may still shape the world beneath yours. Story 4, of Camels in Silence, the logistics of night travel. You wake before dawn in the high desert, your breath misting in the air. Around you a caravan stirs. No horns, no barking orders, just the soft grunt of camels, the creak of rope, and the quiet shuffle of sandals brushing sand. No one speaks. Not yet. The stars are still visible and the moon hangs low. This is the hour of movement, not of the day, but of the night. The ancient Persian Empire, like many before and after it, discovered that the best time to travel was when no one could see you, when the sun would not strike down your animals or your message bearers, when roads cooled and bandits slept, when the silence of the land became a corridor for those who knew how to walk it. This is not a tale of epic battles or royal audiences. This is the story of how logistics happened at night, how darkness became an asset, and how camels plodding, patient, misunderstood became the unsung heroes of empire. Why night? To understand why night travel mattered, you must first imagine the temperatures of the Persian plateau, the terrain, and the animals involved. In the peak of summer, daytime travel across much of Persia from the deserts near Yazd to the plains of Fars was punishing. Heat could soar past 40 degrees C, 104 degrees F, with direct sun exposure lasting over 10 hours. Horses, though fast, were vulnerable to heat exhaustion, especially when burdened. Human couriers suffered from dehydration and disorientation. Camels, on the other hand, preferred the dark. Their physiology, broad feet, fat-storing humps, and a slow, steady gait made them perfect for nocturnal journeys. They could walk for hours without water, required less supervision, and were less susceptible to panic in low-light conditions. But it wasn't just about endurance. Night travel offered three major logistical advantages. Thermal efficiency. Animals and people expended less energy in cooler air. Tactical concealment. Bandits, rival couriers, and even enemy scouts were less likely to operate after dark. Astronomical navigation. Clear desert skies made star-based orientation reliable for trained caravan leaders. This led to the emergence of an entire subculture of night movement, a logistical tradition where movement was measured by moonlight, and stations were marked by torchlight or signal fires. The nocturnal caravans. These were not the royal Angaram riders racing messages across the empire. These were the slower, heavier logistics trains hauling textiles, metals, food, and administrative records. A typical night caravan consisted of 15 to 30 camels, loaded with up to 200 kg each. 2-3 camel masters, usually older men trained in animal behavior and desert survival. 1-2 torchbearers, responsible for scouting ahead and lighting temporary waypoints. An escort, often local guards or armed men, contracted through regional satraps. The rhythm was measured, not rushed. Camels were loaded at dusk, allowed to rest during the heat of the day, and then stirred to movement shortly after the last prayer of evening. They traveled in silence. Orders were issued with hand signals or simple throat sounds. Camels dislike shouting. Their moods shift with tension. A stressed camel can spit, kick, or refuse to rise, costing hours of precious cool time. The caravan moved in single or double file, depending on the path's width. In open desert, they followed star alignments. In hilly terrain, they used memory and touch. The lead camel was always the most experienced and sometimes blind, relying entirely on habit. Each night journey was typically 20-25 kilometers, enough to cross a desert stretch or reach the next water source. Once they arrived at a way station, the camp was set without fire. Smoke attracted insects and unwanted attention. Only oil lamps, shielded from the wind, were used within tents. Silent logistics, loud outcomes. What these caravans carried was not dramatic but essential. Ink and parchment from Babylon to Persepolis. Tin and bronze tools from Anatolia to Elam. Bundles of administrative tablets, sealed and bundled in oilcloth. Salt bricks for preserving meat in outer garrisons. Census records, bound in reed mats, to be deposited at imperial archives. Much of this material was too bulky or fragile for fast horses. Camels bore it without complaint. In some months, dozens of such caravans might crisscross the empire's interior unmarked, uncelebrated, and mostly forgotten. Without them, the empire would grind to a halt. Think of the scene at the city gate near dawn. A caravan shuffles in, dusty and silent. Scribal assistants rush out, untying waterproof bundles. Stamps are checked, deliveries logged. Messages from distant satrapies are opened, dried, copied. The camels, already lying down, begin to chew dry fodder without enthusiasm. Within hours, the administrative wheels begin to turn. Why? Because somewhere last night, a man led 30 camels across a valley, following nothing but stars and the curve of the earth. The unseen infrastructure. These night caravans required their own support system, separate from the Angaram stations. While royal relay posts, chaparkhane, were designed for speed and message switching, caravanserais were designed for rest and bulk storage. The two systems overlapped, but not always. Caravanserais used by night travelers included inner courtyards to shelter animals, water basins and mud cisterns, sometimes cooled by subterranean qanats, water channels, quiet chambers where messages could be dried, resealed, or copied by torchlight. In some locations, station keepers kept wax logs, records of caravans that passed, their cargo seals, their condition. These were often written in Aramaic, the lingua franca of the bureaucracy. Night logistics were tracked but loosely. There was more tolerance for delays. These were not urgent messages, but rather the slow bloodstream of empire. Interestingly, many female laborers, especially in Elamite towns, were tasked with prepping night deliveries. They rolled parchment, packed grain, wrapped ink jars, and prepared oil flasks for couriers. Their names are absent from records, but their hands touched every shipment. Noise and silence, why camels made it possible. The use of camels, rather than oxen or mules, was not just about heat resistance. It was about sound. Camels walk softly. Their padded feet create less vibration, less clatter than hooves. Their breathing is deep and steady. They complain when loaded but fall silent once moving. They are ideal for disappearing into the dark. One Persian proverb, likely older than the empire itself, says, "The loudest cart travels empty, the quiet camel carries gold." Night caravans depended on this silence, not just to avoid attracting attention, but to avoid disturbing the land. Many desert regions were considered sacred. Certain routes passed burial grounds, seasonal temples, or old ruins. Silence was ritualized, not just practical. When passing such sites, caravan masters would strike their staff once, signaling a moment of reflection. Even the camels, trained by routine, would slow down. Some were even trained to kneel silently if halted near such zones. The fragility of the night system. Despite its elegance, night logistics were vulnerable. A single sandstorm could erase paths. An unscheduled lunar eclipse might cause panic among superstitious handlers. Predators, jackals, leopards, even lions could unsettle entire lines of camels. Bandits learned to track caravan shadows, waiting at choke points or water holes. That's why routes were often rotated. One week, a caravan might take the North Trail, the next, the Southern Loop. Messages were sometimes split across two groups to ensure at least one delivery made it. Night travel was secure, but only through habit, discipline, and repetition. Closing the night's journey. By sunrise, the camp is quiet again. Camels chew slowly, couriers sleep in shade, messages are unpacked, their wax softened by heat. Another shipment delivered, another night survived. You wouldn't remember these travelers. They didn't leave monuments, they didn't wear armor, they weren't praised in inscriptions. But without them, your laws wouldn't arrive. Your ink would dry up. Your city would starve during a siege. Your king would not be heard in the provinces. They carried everything that didn't shout across the empire in silence. So as the stars fade and the roads warm, consider this. How much of history was moved by those who preferred not to be seen and spoke only through the dust they left behind. Night settles like parchment laid over the world, soft, blank, and full of possibility. In the heart of the Achaemenid Empire, movement didn't stop when the sun disappeared. It simply became less visible. The empire kept moving by mapping the dark, learning to navigate without seeing, and building a silent network that stretched from the Iranian plateau to the edges of the Levant and beyond. While the famed Royal Road and Angaram couriers carried fast-moving messages by day, the true logistics of empire, the slow, weighty backbone of supply and record-keeping, often moved at night. And remarkably, it did so without artificial light, or with the barest flicker of flame. This section uncovers how the Persians mastered travel by starlight and memory, and how their unseen path shaped an empire's survival. Navigation without lamps. It may surprise you to learn that Persian night travel relied on almost no torchlight. Fire, after all, attracts attention. Even a single oil lamp can be seen for miles across open terrain. In a world without electricity, darkness was safety. Caravan leaders and night couriers developed a system of low-visibility navigation, using astronomy, navigation by constellations, especially the fixed position of the North Star, Tishtria to the Persians, allowed caravans to keep directional bearings. Sound, experienced guides could interpret terrain by echoes and footfall acoustics, differentiating between gravel, clay, or loose sand. Temperature, some terrain changes were felt in the air, cool winds at low passes, warm stillness near rock faces. Animal behavior, camels often resisted changes in terrain. A lead camel's hesitation was often the first sign of a wrong turn or an upcoming incline. The routes used for nocturnal travel were not linear highways. They were textured corridors that followed environmental cues: dry streambeds, rows of tamarisk trees, the scent of distant water, or the upward tilt of the land. This intimate relationship with the sensory map of the terrain made Persian night movement both efficient and incredibly fragile. A new caravan master unfamiliar with a route could easily veer off course. That's why the system depended so heavily on human memory. The mapmakers without maps. There is no surviving Persian night map. No parchment has been uncovered listing star-based routes or audio cues, and yet we know these existed because the system worked. The night logistics of the empire depended on oral cartographers, individuals who memorized every detail of a route across seasons and decades. These were not scholars, they were camel masters, herders, and caravan guards who had walked the same trails hundreds of times. Some became known by their ability to lead caravans blindfolded for parts of the journey, a ritual sometimes performed to demonstrate mastery. One oral tradition, passed down through later Zoroastrian communities, speaks of Mayrad, a caravan guide who could find a desert spring by the echo of his handclap and the coldness of the wind on his right cheek. We don't know if Mayrad was real, but the skill set described was. Many caravan leaders used route chants, half poems, half instructions to remember sequences of terrain. These were recited silently or mouthed during travel. One reconstructed fragment goes: "When the goat scent rises, count to 10. At Windsplit Hill, descend again. When moon is quarter, look to sand. Beneath the mound, the water stands." These chants acted as mnemonic aids, encoding both direction and caution. Some even included emergency detours, should the primary route become blocked by weather or danger. This was not just oral tradition, it was practical survival. Wayfinding by flame, the quiet use of light. Though darkness was preferred, it wasn't absolute. On occasion, signal fires and torch markers were employed, but with precision. Relay stations in remote areas sometimes used shuttered lamps, kept behind walls or stone alcoves, visible only from one direction. These glows were not meant to illuminate the road, but to signal presence to a known approach path. For example, a torch behind a basalt outcrop visible from 500 meters might mark a safe turn near a wadi. Two torches lit in succession on a watchtower could confirm a waiting caravanserai was staffed and secure. A single torch placed low to the ground, half covered, might indicate an emergency rest site established by the military. Fire was used symbolically, not for visibility. In especially remote regions, beacon systems supplemented these signals. Small towers were spaced miles apart and manned only during specific periods, typically when troop movements or supply convoys were expected. Beacons were lit using dung cakes or oiled rags, chosen for minimal smoke. One report from a Babylonian administrative record references a beacon lit twice during the week of the third moon, near the Zagros foothills, likely coordinated to aid in the movement of tribute grain from Elam. But again, these beacons were exceptions, not norms. Most movement occurred in near-complete dark, with leaders trained to spot land shadows under moonlight and feel air currents around ridges and rivers. The role of animals in night travel. Camels were not passive cargo carriers. They were intelligent navigators, and every caravan relied on their intuition. Key facts about camel behavior that supported night travel. They can see in low light better than horses or donkeys, due to a larger pupil and more rods in the retina. They have an excellent sense of smell, detecting water and familiar terrain. They form route memory, returning to known stations without prompting. They are sensitive to terrain underfoot, avoiding unstable ground instinctively. Elite camels, often called road sages in Persian lore, were never sold or traded. They lived long lives, sometimes over 40 years, and were passed down through caravan families. When one died, its saddle was sometimes buried with it, and its hoofprint preserved in mud as a mark of respect. In one anecdote recorded in a Zoroastrian temple ledger, a priest writes, "Without sound we arrived at the place of stars. The camel led us true. We did not light fire. We did not speak. The seal was delivered. It is not signed. Only the symbol of a palm tree and a crescent moon marks its bottom corner." Night travel and the illusion of security. Despite the system's elegance, travel at night was never safe. There were dangers both natural and human. Thieves and deserters waited near known watering holes. Floodwaters could rise unexpectedly in dry riverbeds, especially during spring. Lions and jackals, driven closer to trails by overhunting, were known to disturb caravans. False lights, torches meant to mimic beacon signals, were used to lure couriers into traps. This led to several precautions. Caravan leaders rotated paths, using different trails on return journeys. Convoys carried token offerings for desert spirits, small coins, a smear of date pasted on a rock left as both superstition and signal. Stations began implementing code whistle, specific tonal signals blown through bone flutes to identify themselves. It's worth noting that Persian military couriers, while separate from the angaram, often traveled with caravans at night for protection. This occasional mingling of systems hints at the flexibility built into the empire's infrastructure. No road was ever purely civilian or military. It depended on the season, the route, and the risk. The ritual of arrival. When a night caravan reached its destination just before dawn, a quiet ritual unfolded. Animals were immediately watered, then turned to rest in courtyards. A scribe greeted the leader, recording the arrival time, number of animals, and seal condition. Messages were unwrapped only after sunrise, as reading and transcription required natural light. Couriers and camel masters ate a simple meal: flatbread, dried fruit, barley stew before sleeping through the day. Messages not meant for urgent delivery were stored in wax-sealed jars, sometimes buried beneath layers of cool earth inside stone storerooms. These message pots protected fragile tablets from heat and insects. Many of these jars have been recovered. Some still hold messages unopened, unread, their seals intact. One, found near an ancient relay station in Fars, bore this inscription: "May the night carry this to where it is needed. May no one see the hand that moves it." And that is the essence of Persian night travel: movement without audience, delivery without drama, silence as strategy. A final observation. Today, most of us live surrounded by light, electricity, screens, headlights. We no longer feel the dark pressing in on our journeys. But for millennia, darkness was not absence, it was a working hour. In the Persian Empire, the greatest feats of logistics did not happen under banners or fanfare. They happened between torch flickers, between breaths, between stars. So consider, how much of civilization was shaped by people who worked not in daylight, but in shadow, moving the world forward without ever being seen. Imagine the empire from above, not as kings and capitals, but as a quiet lattice of trails and stations stretching across deserts, valleys, and mountains. Now picture it in darkness, a still map, but somewhere, everywhere, tiny flickers move. A soft creak of leather, a camel's low murmur, a sealed message swaying in its saddle pouch. The empire sleeps, but it is still in motion. This is the final piece of the story. What happens when a civilization chooses to move in silence? The Achaemenid Persian Empire, often remembered for grand palaces and bold conquests, was held together just as much by its invisible logistics. by night caravans and silent routes, by riders who never spoke and seals that were never broken, by travel that was never meant to be seen. The nightwork of empire. We tend to think of empires as daylight machines, armies marching under banners, judges pronouncing law, scribes scratching at midday desks. But an empire that spans thousands of miles cannot afford to wait for the sun. Night travel was the nightwork of empire, the slow movements that no one saw but that made everything else possible. A night courier carrying a letter of pardon to a remote village. A caravan bringing tax grain to an administrative granary in Babylon. A message relayed from a provincial governor, updating census data before a new levy. These weren't glamorous errands, they were foundational. Without them, prisoners would not be freed. Officials would act on outdated reports. Soldiers would receive rations too late. And because many of these deliveries had to happen discreetly, they moved best under the stars. The ethical code of the night couriers. The Angaram system, typically associated with daylight relay riding, had a lesser-known nocturnal branch. Select riders were trained in night relay, operating in pairs or threes, using memory and instinct instead of sight. They were trained in the following: sound discipline, no talking except in emergencies, communication through tapping or bird-like whistles, shadow recognition, identifying terrain features by how they block starlight, seal integrity, inspecting a wax seal purely by touch, water rationing, adjusting for limited access to way stations during unmanned hours. These couriers rarely slept at night. Their entire schedule was reversed. The ethical expectations were high. A night courier was expected to resist opening messages, even when delayed, not seek aid from travelers unless in mortal danger, avoid entering towns to prevent detainment or delay, pass messages forward even if wounded or sick. This made them respected but also feared. Locals called them ghosts on hooves. It was considered bad luck to delay a night courier. Bad crops, misfortune, even divine anger might follow. One superstition claimed that the moon itself would mark anyone who interfered with a sealed message in transit, causing their face to appear blotched and pale for the rest of their life. Night routes in the empire's outer provinces. While the Persian heartland had many overlapping routes, the edge provinces in Egypt, Central Asia, and Anatolia relied even more on night travel. In Jedrosia, modern southeastern Iran, daytime temperatures could rise above 50 degrees C, 122 degrees F. Horses perished. Scrolls caught fire inside satchels. So dispatches were only sent at night, often by camel, mule, or even on foot through mountain paths. In Egypt, Nile-adjacent routes used the moonlight glinting off the river as a guide. Couriers moved by boat at night, with oars muffled in cloth and instructions whispered between banks. In Armenia, night messages relied on torch bridges, a relay of lights arranged along the cliffside trails, visible for just a few seconds as riders passed narrow passes. These trails were too dangerous to traverse at speed during day due to bandits. At night, camouflaged light and trained silence gave safety. This local adaptation meant that night logistics varied, but the principle remained. Darkness isn't delay, darkness is delivery. Light is privilege, who got the fire? In a fascinating detail from the Persepolis Fortification Archive, records show that lamp oil was rationed, and only the highest-ranking caravans or scribes were allotted multiple wicks. This created a hierarchy of illumination. Royal messages, 2 lamps per tent. Provincial supplies, 1 lamp for caravan master only. General cargo, no lamps, fires only outside populated zones. So in most cases, the night journeys happened in full darkness, a deliberate and resource-driven choice. The implication is profound. Light was political. To see at night was a privilege. To move without seeing was the expectation. This extended even to station design. Some caravanserais had windowless chambers, meant for those arriving before dawn, where rest was prioritized over visibility. These rooms were called the sleeping dark, and were often rented by traders who kept their movements private. Collapse in the dark. Eventually, all empires stumble. In the final decades of the Achaemenid Empire, as rebellion stirred and Alexander the Great began his campaign of conquest, the night roads began to fray. Some stations were abandoned, as satraps defected or funds dried up. Caravan leaders were conscripted or fled with their animals. Torches at waypoints remained unlit, creating chaos for scheduled relays. One dispatch from a scribe in western Iran reads, "The lamp did not shine, we waited, we moved by old stars. The third rider fell behind. The seal is intact, but the message is late." There's a quiet sadness in those lines, a system stretched thin, still trying, still honoring its obligations, even as the empire itself began to unravel. This wasn't dramatic collapse, it was erosion, missed handoffs, forgotten rituals, a silence where there once was coordination. And yet, the memory of the night system endured. Alexander did not destroy it, he absorbed it, and later dynasties from the Seleucids to the Sassanids rebuilt it in new forms. Torch routes returned, camels were re-enlisted. The empire had changed, but the method remained. A final reflection. In the end, perhaps this is the greatest lesson the Persian night logistics teach us. Power is not only visible when it is loud. Sometimes, the true strength of a system lies in how quietly it works. While the kings slept in Susa and Persepolis, the empire was still alive, delivered one sealed message at a time, one soft hoofbeat in the sand, one camel's breath in the cold, dark air. We do not know their names. We do not remember their faces. But the world moved because of them. So the next time you send a message, track a package, or rely on something to arrive while you sleep, remember the ones who used to carry messages through the dark. And ask yourself, who still carries the world forward while the rest of us are at rest? Story 5. The Stations of the Empire, Relay Outposts of the Royal Road. You're traveling the Royal Road, not all of it, just a stretch. Perhaps the sun is rising behind you as your horse steps onto the packed dirt track that stretches to the horizon. To your left, hills. To your right, empty scrubland. You carry nothing but a sealed pouch and the knowledge that someone will be waiting at the next stop. You are not alone. You are part of something far larger than a journey. Because this road, this seemingly endless line carved across the earth, is more than a road. It is a system, and it depends on what lies between the cities, not just the cities themselves. This is the story of the relay stations of the Achaemenid Empire. The Chaparkhane, small, anonymous, and boring by design, but absolutely critical to the functioning of the Persian state. This is where messages were passed, horses changed, riders rested, reports logged, and the continuity of an empire was maintained hour by hour between the pillars of stone and the silence of sand. The idea behind the infrastructure. The relay station was not a Persian invention. The Assyrians and Babylonians had used way stations for military messengers. But Darius, arguably, the empire's greatest administrator, took the concept and scaled it into a system. The idea was simple, but revolutionary in its consistency. A network of way stations spaced every 25-30 kilometers. Each station equipped with fresh horses, lodging, and clerical staff. Messages carried by riders who never slept where they received a dispatch. A full-length route Susa to Sardis traversed in 7-9 days, instead of months. It wasn't speed for its own sake. It was about predictability. In an empire that stretched from India to the Aegean, being able to send a message and know exactly when it would arrive was a kind of political control. The relay station was the beating pulse point between each artery of communication, and while it received little attention in poetry or chronicles, it was the reason the empire functioned at all. What did a relay station look like? Most were modest. There was no grand architecture. They weren't built to impress, only to serve. The average chaparcane featured a walled courtyard with one or two gates, one facing forward to the next station, one facing backward to the previous. A stable, usually with 6 to 8 horses, rotated and groomed daily. A record room, where a clerk logged arrivals and dispatches on clay tablets or parchment. A rest chamber with sleeping mats for incoming riders, rarely occupied for long. A supply cache with water, barley, oil, and writing tools. Occasionally, a signal tower or beacon alcove for nighttime orientation. Materials depended on geography. In Mesopotamia, mud brick. In Anatolia, stone. In Iran's central plateau, packed earth with timber beams. They were not fortresses. They were transit points. They existed not to hold territory, but to hold the line of communication. The human machinery inside. Each station was staffed by a small, rotating team. The station keeper, chaparban, oversaw operations, maintained records, enforced schedules. Stable hands fed and groomed horses, checked hooves, replaced tack. Message clerks logged seal condition, logged times, confirmed correct handoffs. Messengers in waiting, standby riders, who could be dispatched if an incoming rider was late or injured. Some stations also included translators, especially in regions with multiple administrative languages, e.g., Aramaic, Elamite, Old Persian. A well-run station had no drama. Riders came in, dismounted, handed off the message, signed the log, mounted a fresh horse, and left often within 5 minutes. There was no ceremony, only procedure. The protocol of a message transfer. Let's follow a message arriving at a station. A rider enters the gate at speed, slows near the courtyard, and calls out a known phrase or signal. The stable hand takes the reins. The horse is led to rest and watered immediately. The rider removes a sealed leather pouch and enters the log room. A clerk checks the condition of the seal. Intact, proceed. Damaged, make a note, inspect for tampering, possibly send double copy forward. The station keeper inscribes a time mark, arrival date and hour. A fresh rider takes the pouch, mounts the next horse, and rides out. Meanwhile, the outgoing record is added to a tally sheet. Once a month, these records were bundled and sent backward toward regional centers. Thus, not only did messages move forward, but tracking data flowed in reverse. This meant that Persian administrators always had current performance data about the communication system. Delays could be investigated, bottlenecks identified, riders reprimanded or reassigned. What did they carry? Relay stations handled only official business. Messages fell into 5 broad categories. Royal orders from the king or royal court, often sealed with gold. Military dispatches, orders, reports, or movement requests. Tax and census records, provincial data sent to central authorities. Resource requests, supplies needed for construction, famine relief, or infrastructure. Governor correspondence, communications between satraps and subordinates. Personal or merchant messages were not permitted, except in rare cases where the sender paid a significant fee and obtained official clearance. Abuse of the system was punishable by law. Some stations also functioned as checkpoints, inspecting merchant traffic for contraband or unsealed correspondence. How were the stations funded? Each station drew resources from the local satrapy. A portion of the regional tax revenue was allocated to maintain the horses, buildings, and staff. Funding breakdowns typically included food rations for staff and animals, ink, clay, and parchment for record keeping, repair supplies for saddles, roofs and fencing. Security in unstable provinces, usually 2 or 3 armed guards, not a garrison. Once a year, inspectors from Susa or Persepolis visited random stations. They conducted audits checking condition, reviewing logs, ensuring that seal protocols were followed. There are surviving reports of fines imposed on station keepers who falsified timing records or failed to maintain adequate animal stock. Failure wasn't tolerated. A broken station didn't just delay a message, it compromised the flow of government. The hidden politics of relay points. While stations were bureaucratic in purpose, they held subtle political weight. Proximity to power. Being near a station gave towns faster access to administration and influence. Visibility. Local leaders could use stations to show loyalty by keeping them in pristine condition. Control. Rebellious satraps sometimes tampered with stations, delaying messages or losing communications inconvenient to their agenda. In one documented case, a satrap in Lydia instructed his station clerk to copy and intercept messages from rival governors before forwarding them. This was discovered after mismatched timestamps were noticed in Sardis and Susa. The satrap was fined and placed under supervision. So while stations appeared neutral, they were in fact nodes of influence, as valuable in diplomacy as they were in delivery. What happened when a station failed? Sometimes a rider did arrive, or a station was found abandoned, or worse, destroyed. In such cases, the next station would dispatch a reserve rider backward to investigate. If the station was compromised, messages were rerouted via alternate trails, usually older, less efficient Elamite or median paths. A report was immediately filed to the nearest satrap, who would deploy assessors or, in rare cases, troops. Messages marked with duplicate seals were considered critical and had 2 copies, so even if one vanished, the other continued. Failure was rare, but when it happened, it revealed how thin the line of empire really was. A few missed horses, a broken fence, a late relay, and the machinery of kingship began to stutter. A final glance at the roadside. As you ride past a station, its courtyard quiet, its clerk leaning against the wall, brush in hand, you might not think much of it. But that little outpost represents the empire, more than the palace or the battlefield. It represents order without spectacle, trust without attention, the ability to connect a village to a king, not with fanfare but with fidelity. And if you dismounted, stepped inside, and opened the logbook, you would see history not in headlines but in timestamps. And you might wonder, what would the world look like if we celebrated the ones who kept it running not through power, but through precision? The great kings of the Achaemenid Empire are remembered for their inscriptions carved in stone and their conquests etched into clay. But the messages that made their rule possible, those traveled on hooves and passed through hands, did not originate in palaces. They passed through mud brick walls, dry courtyards, and canvas sleeping mats at modest outposts we now barely remember. This section continues the journey along the Royal Roads relay system, not through infrastructure, but through people. Who staffed the relay stations? Who ensured the next rider had a horse? The seal stayed unbroken, the arrival was recorded. And why were they so often awake, even when no rider was expected? This is the story of those who stayed behind, so that messages could move forward. The people of the stations, not quite bureaucrats, not quite villagers. Relay station staff were not aristocrats, nor were they peasants. They existed in a strange middle category, a functional class of the empire, permanent servants of the state. The majority were born within a day's walk of the station they served. Some inherited the role, others were appointed. A few were relocated from other regions, especially if they could read or speak multiple administrative languages like Elamite, Aramaic, or Greek. Their official designation varied depending on region, but they were often listed in ledgers as a shabara, carrier or station keeper, pashasuvan, horse feeder, debira, scribe or record keeper, satrapa sabya, satrap appointed overseer in higher-risk provinces. Their work wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and in a time where drought, war, or famine could erase a village overnight, being tied to the state brought a strange sort of security. A day and night in the life of a relay station clerk. Let's walk through the life of Ardashat, a fictional but representative station clerk, stationed midway between Ekbatana and Susa. Morning. Checks the condition of all horses, brushes coats, inspects hooves, ensures feed troughs are clean. Records yesterday's messages in the monthly ledger. Measures and notes oil levels for lamps and ink for styluses. Midday. Reviews the logbooks, ensures time stamps and seal conditions were correctly entered. Rebakes cracked clay tablets, used in hot, dry stations where parchment was unreliable. Sends a stable hand to the nearby village to collect barley, water skins, or hay. Afternoon. Repairs tack stirrups, saddles, reins. Cleans the record room. Trains younger assistants in scribing techniques and royal phrasing conventions. Evening. Watches the road for dust plumes indicating an approaching rider. Maintains the lamp signal if required. Sleeps lightly, never fully resting, always listening for hoofbeats. The motto among station clerks was, "The road never sleeps, so neither do we." And it was, in many cases, true. Horse rotation and animal management. One of the station's most vital roles was maintaining the horse pool. Relay horses were not war animals or bred for appearance, they were selected for durability, even temperament, and speed over short bursts. Each station kept 6 to 8 horses in rotation. 1 to 2 older horses used for short backtracking or in emergencies. A ledger documenting feed times, injuries, and behavioral issues. They were fed a mix of barley mash, high energy, dry grasses, occasionally dried dates or honey to boost stamina. Shoeing varied by terrain. In rocky regions, hooves were wrapped with padded leather, not nailed shoes. This preserved hoof health and allowed fast replacement. The horse minders, called aspdaran, often had the most hands-on knowledge in the station. They could detect lameness from the sound of a hoof hitting stone and knew by scent if a horse had taken ill. Their quiet routines, feeding, cleaning, whispering commands, kept the whole system running. The ethics and enforcement of trust. The Persian relay system functioned on an invisible currency, trust. No locks sealed the message pouches. No armed guards oversaw every transfer. Instead, security relied on seals, wax or clay stamps from governors, scribes, or the royal court. Any tampering was immediately evident. Logs, each handoff recorded arrival time, messenger name, seal condition. Redundancy, key messages were duplicated and sent via staggered relays. Tampering with a message was treated as a crime of treason. The punishment ranged from fines and exile to public floggings, or, in severe cases, execution. And yet, despite these risks, there are remarkably few records of message interference. Why? Because the system selected for loyalty. Station workers often stayed in their roles for decades. They lived modestly but with pride. Their children were literate. They were part of something larger, and to betray it meant losing everything, not just their post, but their identity. The loneliness of the relay worker. Despite their importance, relay staff lived quiet, often lonely lives. They were stationed away from towns, sometimes on desolate stretches where riders might only arrive once a day or not at all during certain seasons. Visitors were rare, contact with outsiders was discouraged, gossip was risky. Records from station logs occasionally include non-standard entries. No rider today, winds from the west, smoke on the horizon, possible bandit fire. Horse 3 gave birth, foal weak, midwife sent from village. Scribe ill, fever and tremble still made log, ink weak. These aren't grand historical records, but they are real. They tell us that behind the smooth machinery of the empire were humans enduring isolation, fatigue, and sometimes fear. Their loyalty wasn't enforced, it was earned, built through repetition, routine, and an understanding that no one else would do what they did. Women in the relay system. While men staffed most relay stations, some evidence suggests women played important supporting roles, especially in isolated or rural stations. Clay tablets from Persepolis mention caretakers of food stores, recorders of parchment in absence of clerk, healers of hoof rot, childbearers in station house. In emergencies, wives of station keepers may have managed handoffs themselves. One recovered Elamite record includes a signature from Tari, wife of Harkesh, who received the message at second bell. They were never officially acknowledged in royal archives, but they kept the fire burning, the food stocked, the books balanced. Their names are mostly lost, but their hands are all over the history of motion. The price of failure. When a station failed to perform delayed handoff, missing log, missing horse, the punishment was swift. Fines paid to the satrapy. Suspension of the station keeper, sometimes replaced by a rival station's deputy. Investigation logs dispatched to Persepolis. One famous case details how a station near Sardis was found with falsified entries. The clerk had written fictional riders and timestamps to hide a horse rot outbreak that delayed 3 days of messages. He was stripped of position, the station was temporarily closed, and oversight was placed under a royal inspector for 6 months. The empire could afford war, revolt, even assassination. But it could not afford a broken relay chain. A closing scene in a dusty courtyard. Imagine it again. A small relay outpost. The wind smells of dust and barley. A single oil lamp burns near a door. You hear hoofbeats in the distance, first faint, then clear. The horse arrives, glistening with sweat. The rider dismounts. A leather pouch changes hands. A signature is made. The new rider mounts, turns, and vanishes into the night. No speeches. No monuments. No reward. Just one more message on its way. Just one more thread holding the empire together. And perhaps you wonder, how many forgotten people spent their lives making sure the world didn't fall apart between messages? When the Achaemenid Empire fell, it didn't do so in a single moment. No great crack split the royal road. No sweeping fire consumed the relay stations overnight. The collapse came more like an unraveling, gradual, bureaucratic, and strangely quiet. It was not a story told in battles or palaces. It was told in messages that stopped arriving, in horses left unwatered, in clerks who waited in vain for riders that would never come again. This final section traces the decline of the Royal Roads relay system, its afterlife in successor empires, and the strange ways these seemingly boring outposts left a legacy far beyond their intended use. The system that survived its empire. By the time Alexander the Great marched into the Persian heartland in 331 BCE, the Royal Road had already been in operation for nearly 2 centuries. The Macedonians, astonished by its efficiency, did not destroy it. In fact, Alexander reportedly used the relay stations himself, ordering messages sent to his governors in Babylon and beyond. But while the road remained, the system behind it, the invisible layers of administration, oversight, and local coordination, began to weaken. Why? Many Persian station keepers fled or were dismissed. Local satrapies no longer contributed taxes to maintain the stations. Without inspection logs from Persepolis or Susa, compliance weakened. Greek military priorities emphasized mobility and conquest, not logistical consistency. So the stations didn't fall, they faded. Horses died, clay tablets went unbaked, oil lamps went cold. The stations that once pulsed with imperial rhythm fell out of sync with their purpose. Ghost stations and the silence between cities. Within a generation, many chaparcane had become abandoned shells. Travelers on the old royal road began encountering empty courtyards filled with weeds, stables half collapsed, with broken beams and nesting birds, logbooks with dates stopping abruptly, sometimes mid-sentence, saddles left hanging, untouched for years. Some stations were repurposed, used by local lords for tolls, or turned into inns by opportunistic villagers. Others simply returned to the dust. One Babylonian traveler writing in the Seleucid period described stopping at what he believed was once a relay station. There were broken walls, a metal hinge in the dirt, and a scratched name on clay. I slept where riders once changed their mounts. In the morning I rode on. Nothing answered me but wind. The once precise system had become myth and memory. Legacy in Rome, China, and beyond. But the idea of the relay station did not vanish. It migrated. The Romans, inspired by Persian methods, developed their own version. The cursus publicus, a state-run postal system with stations and wayhouses. In Han Dynasty China, similar stations, known as yi, formed the backbone of imperial communication, modeled in part on talis from the West. In medieval Persia, the relay concept was reintroduced under the Seljuks, and later the Mongols, who formalized it into the famous yam system of the Silk Road. And even today, the core idea survives in modern logistics. Waypoints for long-distance delivery, distribution centers for message sorting, timestamp tracking for accountability. So the chaparcane, those plain outposts of imperial silence, left behind more than a memory. They shaped the architecture of communication itself. Archaeological echoes, what's left today. Scattered across Iran, Turkey, Iraq, and Syria are the faint ruins of relay stations. Most are unmarked, few are excavated. But for those who seek them, signs remain. Foundations of stone or hardened earth. Clay tablets with symbols denoting message types. Bone fragments of horses buried near stables. Pottery shards stamped with royal emblems or satrapy seals. In some villages, the name of the location still bears the echo. Chaparabad, place of the post, Borji Chapar, tower of the rider, or Kanhi Payam, house of the message. These ruins whisper not of conquest or kingship, but of the quiet machinery that enabled those things to exist at all. Historians and the boring records. Why are these stations so often forgotten? Because historians favored the dramatic. Palaces, wars, treaties, betrayals. Relay stations left no speeches, no poetry, no rebellion. Just timestamps, logs, receipts, hoof prints. But in recent decades, a new generation of scholars has turned to these materials, seeing in them the true workings of ancient empire. The scribes who cross-checked seal records across provinces. The regional differences in horse feed practices. The patterns of delay suggesting seasonal flooding or conflict. This is not the history of kings, but of functionaries, of systems, of the invisible scaffolding that held the ancient world together. And it may be, in some ways, more real than any coronation or battlefield. A reflection on stillness and motion. As we close this story of the stations of the empire, let's return to the image. A narrow road, a horse, a sealed message, a station glowing faintly in the dark, a clerk stirring from rest, scratching ink on clay, a rider remounting, not knowing who the message is for, only that it must keep moving. These were not heroes. They were not visionaries. But they were necessary. In a world where connectivity defines power, Their legacy is not in ruins but in rhythms. In the beat of a hoof, the flick of a seal, the moment one hand lets go and another takes hold. And perhaps it's worth asking, what would collapse first, not the empire, but the flow if those hands had simply stopped reaching out? Story 6. The Accountants of Persepolis, Boring Budgets That Built an Empire. You wouldn't have noticed them if you visited Persepolis in its heyday. They weren't in the throne room. They didn't wear jewelry. They didn't march with armies or stand at the steps of the Apadana. They sat day after day in small offices, scribbling on clay tablets. These were the accountants of Persepolis, the quiet bureaucrats of the Achaemenid Empire. They did not rule, but their ledgers shaped who got paid, who got fed, and who kept building the very foundations of the empire's glory. This is not the history of kings. This is the history of supply quotas, animal rations, and labor audits. It is, quite possibly, the most boring but most revealing part of ancient Persia's power. Let's take a deep breath and walk into the dusty backrooms of Persepolis, the rooms filled not with gold, but with records. The treasury that breathed. Persepolis, founded by Darius I around 518 BCE, is known for its monumental architecture, staircases carved with processions, columns rising like trees. But beneath this grandeur sat a vast administrative apparatus. The Persepolis fortification and treasury archives, discovered in the 20th century, include tens of thousands of clay tablets mostly written in Elamite, the regional administrative language. These weren't religious texts, they weren't royal declarations. They were receipts, inventory sheets, logs of beer rations, travel records for goat herders, assignments for stone haulers. In other words, accounting. And they tell us more about how the Achaemenid Empire functioned than many royal inscriptions. The tablet that records lunch. One of the most mundane and fascinating types of tablets reads like this: 23 workers assigned to road repair near Tauk. They receive each 1.5 liters of barley, 1 liter of beer, 1 sheep per 10 men monthly. Recorded on the 17th of the month of Animaca, year 13 of Darius. This one record tells us who was working, what they were doing, what their rations were, where they were, when it happened. It is profoundly unremarkable and profoundly important, because with tens of thousands of such tablets, you can reconstruct an empire's entire internal economy, from meat and grain to labor movement and gender roles. The bureaucracy of barley. Barley wasn't just food, it was currency, it was a metric of labor. The accountants tracked it in incredible detail. Adult male laborers received a full ration. Adult females received 2/3 of that. Children got 1/3 or half depending on age. Pregnant women or new mothers were often allotted additional oil or beer. These values weren't decided by whim. They followed established rationing guidelines known as kurtash, which formed the foundation of state-controlled labor management. What does this tell us? That the empire valued predictability and equity, even in small things. That a system built to move armies and rule satraps still counted how much beer a woman in Elam got during lambing season. And a person like you sat and wrote that number carefully on clay. Names that linger in clay. What's striking is how many individuals are named in these records. We meet Erdis Juna, a woman in charge of a team distributing sheep rations. Shabada, a supervisor of brickmakers. Nabazish, a courier receiving travel rations. Barishia, a scribe's assistant who signed off on a worker bonus. These aren't just roles, these are people with tasks and timelines. Many tablets include their personal seals, sometimes simple circles, sometimes carved images of animals or gods. These seals served as signatures and official approval. It reminds us, even in a rigid system, identity mattered. Trust was personal. Accountability came not only from the top, but from individual responsibility recorded in hardened clay. Logistics over luxury. The Treasury archives also show that massive logistical efforts underpinned imperial building projects. When Darius or Xerxes built temples or palaces, the process looked like this. Stone cutters logged daily movement of slabs. Team leaders received barley allocations for their crews. Wagon drivers registered the distance traveled and submitted wear reports. Stable managers recorded horse feed and injury logs. Storehouses tallied timber, bitumen, reeds, and ropes issued and returned. None of these workers are named in Herodotus, but their footprints paved Persepolis. And their scribes recorded everything not because they were inspired, but because they were paid to. It was bureaucracy as survival mechanism. Women in the records. Unexpectedly, the Persepolis tablets reveal a significant number of female administrators. Some tablets list women managing work gangs, women distributing rations, women supervising the transport of goods. They're referred to with titles that translate as chief, distributor, or controller. There are even records of childcare provisions, suggesting that women workers brought children and received special support. This was not equality as we understand it, but it was complex, and it challenges many assumptions about gender in ancient administrative systems. And again, it was captured not in proclamations, but in accounting tablets. The quiet power of paperwork. In the long shadow of Achaemenid grandeur, it is easy to overlook the accountant. But here's the reality. When satraps made promises, they relied on these clerks to track if they were kept. When armies moved, the supplies they consumed were counted before they left. When palaces were built, the wages, tools, and beer were all logged in triplicate. These scribes didn't just manage logistics, they enforced the state's memory. They were the ones who noticed when something didn't add up. And in an empire that spanned continents, that attention to detail was not boring, it was necessary. A glimpse into a clay archive. Let's pause and imagine the room. It's dim. The walls are lined with low wooden shelves. On those shelves sit thousands of small clay tablets, rectangular or square, some with thumbprints still visible. At the center, a clerk sits cross-legged, stylus in hand. A laborer approaches, dusty from the road, with a bag of barley and a sheep tag. The clerk nods, opens a fresh piece of clay, and begins inscribing. 2 sheep, 23 liters of barley, returned by Dazata, verified by Ariamna, year 27 of Darius. It's not dramatic, it's not memorable. But that small act of recording tied one thread of order into the empire. And now, 2,500 years later, we can still read it. An unresolved thought. So many of history's questions are grand. Why did an empire fall? Who won the war? What caused the rebellion? But perhaps the more intimate and enduring questions are simpler. Who recorded the barley? Who counted the sheep? And what happened when those ledgers stopped being written? When the scribes put down their styluses? When the kilns stopped baking tablets? When the archives were no longer updated, that too was an ending. Not with fire, not with swords, but with silence. And perhaps that's the real mark of collapse. Not when kings die, but when the accountants go home. We often think of information flow in ancient empires as the domain of couriers, of fast riders, sealed messages, and roads stretching across deserts and mountains. But the truth is that long before a message ever left a city, it was already part of a web, a bureaucratic network of ledgers, clerks, and clay. This section explores how the accountants of Persepolis didn't just tally goods. They created an internal communication system, a living archive that connected construction sites, storehouses, farms, and temples without the need for constant travel. It was not fast. It was not glamorous. But it worked, and it kept the empire alive. The internal web of paperless control. Persepolis was not just a palace, it was an information node. From here, and from sites like Susa and Ecbatana, the empire managed labor flow, tribute storage, and project scheduling through clay. The core mechanism was a chain of observation by foremen or site scribes, record-keeping on clay tablets or wooden tallies, verification via seals and secondary logs, transfer of tablets to regional archives, synthesis at Persepolis. In other words, each site didn't operate in isolation. It contributed to an ever-expanding web of synchronized knowledge, coordinated through shared tablet formats, recognized seal authorities, standardized weight and ration metrics, regular submission intervals. The result, a passive but pervasive communication system that minimized the need for directives, because local administrators already knew what needed doing based on the archive flow. This is decentralized command, centuries before the term existed. The clay mail of the empire. Let's walk through a fictional but entirely plausible example. Situation. A granary near Shiraz receives an unusually large delivery of barley from a nearby satrap. Step 1. The granary clerk writes a tablet. 73 satchels of barley received, 5 over expected. Origin, Pasargati. Supervisor, Bagadata. Recipient, Granary 3B, Shiraz. Verified by seal. Step 2. A copy of this is sent to the local administration office, where it's logged with other agricultural inputs. Step 3. At the end of the month, a summary tablet is created listing all overages, shortfalls, and discrepancies. This tablet is sealed by the provincial overseer and sent by caravan to Persepolis. Step 4. In Persepolis, a clerk receives this tablet. He compares it against satrapy-wide records, notes the surplus, and forwards a recommendation tablet, perhaps increasing barley allocations for nearby labor projects. Step 5. That recommendation doesn't need to be enforced by decree. Local clerks read the new data and adjust rations accordingly. No royal orders, no horseback messengers. Just clay. Memory made visible. Each tablet was not a standalone object. It was part of a larger relational system. The scribes used edge notches to indicate a series or batch, stylus impressions to denote category like transport or ration, seal patterns to validate authorization, string holes to bind sets of tablets together. In essence, the accountants of Persepolis were programmers of a clay-based information network. And it had redundancy, hierarchy, and validation protocols built in. Scribes, not just writers, but interpreters. While it's tempting to imagine accountants as passive number crunchers, the truth is more dynamic. They often interpreted incomplete data, flagged inconsistencies, nodding, missing barley, investigation requested, authored guidance tablets for lesser clerks, trained successors using annotated teaching tablets. In fact, entire collections of model tablets have been found suggesting that scribal education was rigorous and standardized. So these were not low-level clerks. They were the cognitive infrastructure of the empire. Data verification, seals, duplicates, and audits. You may wonder, how did they trust the data? They had a system. Seals, personal, family, or institutional seals acted as signatures. Duplicates. Many tablets were written in pairs, one for local use, one for central archives. Audits checked tablets were sent independently by inspectors. Cross-referencing. Scribes were trained to verify tablet contents across logbooks. This means any suspicious discrepancy could be flagged without needing a king to intervene. The scribes were empowered to ask questions like, why are laborers in region A getting less beer than region B? Why did the wool inventory drop by 20 units last month? Why has one seal not appeared for 4 months? It was oversight without violence. Boredom as a system strength. The predictability of the accounting process was not a flaw, it was its greatest strength. Because it made errors visible. It made patterns detectable. It made fraud risky. It made planning possible. You could look at 5 years of goat distribution logs and predict seasonal meat shortages, or track labor absenteeism based on food allotment fluctuations. The empire's ability to plan long-term building palaces, canal networks, and military campaigns was due in large part to this quiet, iterative recording process. In that sense, the accountants of Persepolis were not just managing the present, they were storing the future. The invisible architects. And yet, none of these scribes are commemorated in official histories. You will not find a tomb for Zardek the ledger master, who oversaw rationing for 12,000 laborers. You will not read poems about Tuktama, who verified seal codes across 7 provinces for 18 years. But if either had stopped working, even for a week, a construction site would have stalled, a food shortage would have spread, a caravan would have waited. And yet they worked on. Unknown. Unread. Essential. A quiet network's loud legacy. While the Persepolis archive was unique, it inspired other imperial centers to maintain their own systems. Babylonian accountants mimicked the seal verification method. Greek administrators studied Elamite record-keeping during the Seleucid period. Later Islamic accountants adopted multi-copy bookkeeping in tax offices. And even modern postal systems evolved from the same need, to track things without presence. So the dusty clay ledgers of Persepolis, though quiet, laid the foundation for how complex societies manage themselves today. An unresolved question. One can't help but ask. When the clay stopped being molded, when the styluses were set down, when the kilns grew cold, did the empire realize what it had lost? Not a king, not a treasury, but a system of knowing patient, precise, and profoundly dull. Did they see it slipping away? Or did it vanish silently, like so many things built with care instead of celebration? It didn't come with fire. The end of the Persepolis administrative system, one of the most detailed bureaucracies of the ancient world, didn't begin with an enemy at the gate. It began with a disruption in data flow. Some tablets weren't delivered. Rations didn't match. Names stopped appearing. And then, one day, a clerk pressed his stylus into wet clay for the last time, and no one recorded what happened next. This section traces how collapse came quietly to the scribes and accountants of Persepolis, and how their forgotten clay tablets became, paradoxically, the loudest voices of their time rediscovered centuries later. The quiet unraveling begins. In 330 BCE, Alexander the Great entered Persepolis. The Macedonian army looted the city and famously set fire to parts of the palace complex, perhaps as a symbolic act of revenge for Xerxes' burning of Athens. But long before the flames, the administrative system had already begun to fray. Historians and archaeologists have noted a decline in tablet production in the years immediately preceding Alexander's arrival. The reasons are subtle but telling. Fewer new scribes trained. Reductions in long-range audit reports. Disappearance of some key seal authorities. A shift in language from Elamite to Aramaic and Greek. This suggests that Persepolis was becoming less of a central administrative hub and more of a ceremonial capital under later Achaemenid rulers like Artaxerxes III and Darius III. When the real logistical operations began moving elsewhere, perhaps to Babylon, or Susa, the bureaucratic heart of Persepolis weakened. And with it, so did its memory. The last tablets, the final wave of Persepolis tablets, dated around 330 BCE, are haunting. They include incomplete ration logs with missing values, audit reports with no confirming responses, clay fragments with broken seal impressions. Some tablets appear unfinished, with only headers or recipient names perhaps abandoned mid-task as events spiraled. One chilling detail: the very last datable tablet, recorded in the final year of Darius III, shows a request for additional oxen fodder, but the fulfillment record never appears. It ends simply with, "To be confirmed by blank." And then silence. Clay survives what marble cannot. Persepolis burned, statues shattered, throne rooms crumbled, but the clay survived. Why? Because thousands of tablets were stored in sealed jars, buried archives, and thick-walled storage rooms, some of which were baked into permanence by the very fires that consumed the palace. Ironically, the destruction preserved them. These tablets sat buried in the ruins of Persepolis for over 2,000 years, until the 1930s, when the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago excavated them during a major archaeological mission. What they found was not gold, not jewels, but a bureaucratic time capsule, tens of thousands of records painstakingly inscribed by forgotten hands. It was the voice of an empire's function, not its glory. The absence of orders. Perhaps the most profound thing about these tablets is what they lack. There are no orders from the king, no declarations of war, no speeches, just numbers, names, rations, approvals, delays, deliveries. This absence is meaningful. It tells us that the true machinery of empire, the reason roads got built, workers got paid, and palaces rose, wasn't the ruler's charisma. It was consistency. When that consistency broke down, when barley wasn't delivered, when workers stopped receiving sheep, when seals no longer held authority, the empire weakened not through conquest, but through interruption of the ordinary. The ledgers, in going silent, mark the real collapse. What was lost and what was found. What does the end of the accounting system mean for us today? For centuries, the knowledge of Persepolis was lost. The names of its scribes, the methods of its inventory, the complexities of its ration system. But once translated, the tablets revealed a sophisticated data tracking system, an empire capable of decentralized management, evidence of female administrative authority, models of labor management and welfare provisioning. In other words, they gave us not a picture of Persian kingship, but a manual of Persian statecraft. One not written by historians, but by the people who made the empire work. Echoes in modern governance. The legacy of the Persepolis accountant still resonates. Today's government agencies still rely on performance audits, field reports, and logistical rations tools first honed in places like Persepolis. The practice of issuing duplicates, stamping documents, and maintaining archive series originated in these early clay systems. Even the concept of paper trails can be traced to clay trails, paths of accountability encoded in baked earth. So while the tablets may seem boring, they are in fact ancestral artifacts of modern administration. And in a way, the scribes of Persepolis are still with us every time we log an expense, check a shipment, or file a report. The memory of the scribe. The final tragedy of the Persepolis accountants is that they were never memorialized. No statues, no tomb inscriptions, no epic poems. They lived, recorded, and vanished. But when we read their tablets today, we participate in their quiet resurrection. We hear the scratch of stylus on clay. We see the laborer waiting for his barley. We smell the wax seal pressed into warm earth. We feel the weight of a sheep ledger passed from one hand to another. And we understand these were not minor details. These were the spine of civilization. A final reflection. Empires do not rise because of kings. They rise because people wake up every day and do the work. The stone hauler, the grain clerk, the fodder manager, the scribe. And they fall not when the army loses, but when that daily rhythm, those unglamorous routines break down. So if you're ever looking for the soul of a civilization, don't start with its palaces. Start with its paperwork. Start with the question, what happens when the ledgers go quiet and no one notices until it's too late?